In the mist-shrouded peaks of the Andes, where the air grows thin and the gods seem close enough to touch, there once stood an empire that defied every law of geography and governance. Without wheels, without writing, without iron, the Inca forged the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. Yet in a single afternoon in 1532, 168 Spanish conquistadors would bring 10 million subjects to their knees. This is the story of Inca, the empire that rose like the sun over the mountains, only to set in blood and conquest. 1. Origins in the mists of time. Deep in the heart of the Andes, where the earth reaches toward heaven and the very stones seem to hold memories, lies a valley that would birth an empire. But long before the first Inca ever claimed divine descent from the sun, this land pulsed with human ambition. The story begins not with conquest, but with mystery. Archaeological evidence whispers of continuous human habitation in the Cusco Valley stretching back over 6,000 years, layers upon layers of civilizations building upon the dreams and ruins of those who came before. The Marcaval culture, the Canapita people, and finally the Quilca, each leaving their mark on this sacred landscape. By 900 CE, the Quilca culture dominated this valley, their pottery and architectural styles hauntingly similar to what would later become recognizably Inca. Were the Inca conquerors, or were they inheritors? The truth, like so much of their early history, remains shrouded in the mists of time. But the Inca themselves told a different story, one that would echo through the corridors of their great palaces and shape the identity of an empire. They spoke not of gradual cultural evolution, but of divine intervention and destiny manifest. Listen to the wind across Lake Titicaca, and you might still hear the echo of their most sacred legend. From the cold, deep waters of this highest navigable lake in the world, Inti, the sun god himself, sent forth his children to civilize a world lost in darkness and barbarism. The legend speaks of Manco Capac and his sister wife Mama Aklo, emerging from the sacred island of the sun with a golden staff and a divine mission. Inti commanded them to travel north until the staff would sink completely into the earth. There they would establish their capital and begin their sacred work of bringing order to chaos. For days they journeyed through the harsh beauty of the Altiplano, past snow-capped peaks, and through valleys where the wind carries the voices of ancient spirits. At every stop, Manco Capac would drive the golden staff into the earth, but it would not sink. Not until they reached a verdant valley where 3 rivers converged, the Valley of Cusco, did the earth accept their divine mandate. But there was another tale, perhaps even more revealing of the Inca worldview, the legend of the Ayer brothers. 4 brothers and 4 sisters emerged from the cave of Pacaratambo, each possessing supernatural powers. Through trials and transformations that speak to the Andean understanding of sacred landscape, 3 brothers became mountains, and 1, Ayer Manco, became the first Inca. These were not merely stories told around ancient fires. They were the foundational myths of an empire, carefully crafted to justify rule over millions. Every Inca nobleman knew these tales by heart, for they explained not just where they came from, but why they had the right to rule the world. Modern historians like Maria Rostworowski and John Howland Rowe have suggested these legends mask a more complex reality, perhaps the memory of migrations from the collapsing Tiwanaku culture around Lake Titicaca, perhaps the gradual coalescence of local Cusco groups around emerging leaders who claimed divine sanction. The great city of Tiwanaku, with its massive stone gateways and astronomical alignments, had dominated the southern Andes for over 1,000 years before its mysterious abandonment around 1000 CE. Did refugees from this collapsing civilization carry their knowledge north to Cusco? The architectural similarities are striking. The same massive stone construction, the same precise astronomical alignments. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 1200 CE, the group that would become known as the Inca were one of many small chiefdoms competing for control in the Cusco Valley. They were the Quilca culture's inheritors, building upon established trade networks and agricultural techniques. that had sustained life in this challenging environment for millennia. The real genius of the early Inca was not in conquest, but in synthesis. They took the agricultural innovations of their predecessors, the intricate terracing that turned mountain slopes into productive farmland, the sophisticated understanding of high-altitude crops like quinoa and potatoes, and began to organize them on an unprecedented scale. The first historical Inca ruler, Manco Capac, probably lived around 1200 CE, though separating history from legend becomes nearly impossible. What we do know is that the early Inca rulers, Sinchi Roca, Loki Panki, Meda Capac, gradually expanded their influence through marriage alliances, strategic marriages, and small-scale warfare that was more about prestige and cattle raiding than territorial conquest. For over 2 centuries, the Inca remained what they had always been, one regional power among many, distinguished perhaps by their organizational skills and their growing reputation for honoring alliances, but hardly destined for empire. The Great Chimer Kingdom controlled the coast with its massive capital at Chan Chan. The Lapaka Confederation dominated the region around Lake Titicaca. The Chanca people controlled territories to the west. But something was stirring in Cusco. The Inca were developing something that would prove more powerful than any army, an ideology of expansion coupled with administrative techniques that could manage diversity on an unprecedented scale. They were beginning to see themselves not merely as one group among many, but as the chosen people of Inti, destined to bring divine order to the chaos of a fragmented world. By 1400 CE, the Inca controlled perhaps 20 miles around Cusco, a prosperous valley kingdom, but hardly remarkable by Andean standards. Their capital was a modest city of stone and adobe. Their military consisted of a few thousand warriors equipped with bronze weapons and wooden shields. They worshipped the sun and honored their ancestors, practiced sophisticated agriculture, and maintained complex marriage alliances with neighboring groups. Yet within 40 years, these same people would rule an empire stretching 2,500 miles from north to south, governing more territory than any state in the Americas before or since. The transformation would be so dramatic, so complete, that it would seem to later generations like the work of the gods themselves. The catalyst for this transformation would come not from divine intervention, but from the most human of sources, the crucible of war and the genius of a prince who refused to accept defeat. In the year 1438, everything would change. The age of the Inca Empire was about to begin. 2. The Great Transformation, Pachacutic's Revolution. The year 1438 dawned like any other in the Inca kingdom, but by its end, the very foundations of the Andean world would be shattered and rebuilt. Sometimes history pivots on a single moment, a single decision, a single act of courage that changes everything. For the Inca, that moment came with the thunder of war drums and the sight of an enemy army descending upon their sacred capital. From the west came the Chanca Confederation, a powerful alliance of warrior tribes who had spent generations honing their military skills in the harsh highlands. They had watched the growing prosperity of Cusco with envious eyes, and now they marched with 40,000 warriors, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the mountain sun, their war cries echoing off the stone terraces that stepped up the valley walls. The 8th Inca ruler, Viracocha Inca, was an old man who had grown comfortable in peace. When scouts brought word of the approaching Chanca army, panic seized the royal court. Viracocha and his chosen heir, Prince Urco, made a decision that would echo through history. They fled. Picture the scene. The most sacred city in the Inca world, home to the golden temple of the sun, abandoned by its divine ruler in its hour of greatest need. The common people who could not flee looked to the heavens and wondered if the gods themselves had forsaken them. But in that moment of absolute despair, one man stepped forward. Prince Cusi Yupanqui was not supposed to be the heir. He was a younger son, perhaps more interested in military affairs than court ceremony. But as the Chanca army approached the outskirts of Cusco, he made a choice that would reshape the world. He would not flee. He would not surrender. He would fight. The battle that followed would become legend. With perhaps 10,000 hastily assembled defenders, farmers and craftsmen who had never faced a professional army, Kusi Yupanqui prepared to defend the city that his father had abandoned. The Inca, supremely confident, probably expected the city to surrender without a fight. But Kusi Yupanqui understood something that would define his entire reign. That belief can be more powerful than bronze, that inspiration can triumph over overwhelming odds. He told his people that their ancestor spirits, the very stones of the city, would rise to fight beside them. And in the heat of battle, with victory hanging by a thread, something extraordinary happened. The Inca chroniclers would later claim that the stones themselves came alive, transforming into warriors to fight alongside the defenders. The Spanish, recording these accounts a century later, dismissed them as primitive superstition. But perhaps they missed the deeper truth, that Kusi Yupanqui had achieved something far more miraculous than animate stones. He had transformed a collection of terrified individuals into a unified force willing to die for an idea. Against all odds, the Inca were defeated. Their army, which had seemed invincible that morning, fled in disorder, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and most importantly, their reputation for invincibility. Word spread through the Andes like wildfire. The Inca had not merely survived, they had triumphed through divine intervention. But Kusi Yupanqui was just beginning. When his father Viracocha returned, expecting to resume his throne as if nothing had happened, the prince who had saved the kingdom refused to step aside. In a tense confrontation that nearly sparked civil war, he forced his father's abdication and claimed the throne with a name that announced his intentions to the world: Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, reverser of the world. And reverse the world he did. Where previous Inca rulers had been content to manage their prosperous valley kingdom, Pachacuti envisioned something unprecedented: a unified Andean world under Inca rule, organized according to divine principles that would bring order to chaos and prosperity to all. His first innovation was administrative. The old system of personal rule, where the Inca governed through kinship ties and personal relationships, could never manage an empire. Pachacuti created the Tawantinsuyu, the four parts together, dividing all territory into four quarters that met at Cusco, the navel of the world. Chinchaysiyu to the northwest, Antisiyu to the northeast, Calasiyu to the southeast, and Canisiyu to the southwest. Each quarter would be governed by an Apu, a royal relative with absolute authority in the Inca's name. Below them, a hierarchy of administrators would manage provinces, districts, and local communities with mathematical precision. But Pachacuti's genius lay not just in administration, but in ideology. He transformed the Inca origin myths from local tribal stories into imperial propaganda that justified unlimited expansion. If the Inca were truly the children of Inti, the sun god, then they had not just the right, but the divine obligation to bring all peoples under their enlightened rule. The great temple of the sun, Coricancha, was rebuilt on a scale that took the breath away. Its walls were covered in sheets of gold, its garden filled with golden replicas of corn plants and llamas. Here, the mummies of dead Inca rulers held court, consulted on matters of state as if death were merely another form of service to the empire. Pachacuti understood that an empire is built as much with symbols as with swords. He redesigned Cusco itself to serve as a living representation of Inca cosmology. The city was laid out in the shape of a puma, the sacred animal of the Inca, with the fortress of Sacsayhuaman forming its head and the confluence of two rivers marking its tail. The construction projects were staggering. Sacsayhuaman Fortress, built with stones some weighing over 100 tons, fitted together so precisely that 5 centuries later, you still cannot slide a knife blade between them. How do they move these massive blocks without wheels, without iron tools, without draft animals larger than llamas? The techniques remain a mystery that humbles modern engineers. But perhaps Pachacuti's greatest innovation was social. He created the MITA system, a labor tax that required every able-bodied man to contribute a portion of his time to state projects. Not slavery, but a form of citizenship that bound every subject to the empire through service. In return, the state guaranteed food security, protection from famine, and care for the disabled and elderly. Under this system, the Inca could mobilize hundreds of thousands of workers for projects that boggled the imagination. Agricultural terraces that transformed barren mountainsides into productive farmland, roads that spanned continents, storehouses that could feed entire populations through years of drought. The MITA made the impossible routine. Pachacuti also revolutionized Inca military organization. The old tribal levies gave way to professional armies organized in decimal units, squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, and divisions of 10,000. Each unit had its own commanders, its own standards, its own specialized role in battle. But the Inca way of war was unlike anything the world had seen. They preferred negotiation to battle, incorporation to destruction. Conquered peoples who submitted peacefully were allowed to keep their local customs, their local leaders, even their local gods, as long as they acknowledged Inca supremacy and accepted Inti as the supreme deity. Those who resisted faced the full fury of Inca military might. But even then, the goal was not extermination but transformation. Rebellious populations were relocated to distant parts of the empire through the Minimus system, while loyal colonists were moved in to take their place. Within a generation, the ethnic map of the Andes was completely redrawn. By the time of Pachacuti's death in 1471, the Inca Empire had expanded from a single valley to encompass most of modern Peru and parts of Ecuador or Bolivia. But more than territorial conquest, Pachacuti had achieved something far more significant. He had created a system that could continue to expand and integrate new peoples indefinitely. The boy prince who had refused to flee in 1438 had indeed reversed the world. He had taken a kingdom and created an empire, transformed a tribal confederation into a civilization that would span continents. But his greatest achievement was not what he built, but what he made possible. He had created the framework for an empire that his successors would expand to limits that even he could not have imagined. When Spanish chroniclers later tried to understand how such a vast empire could have been built so quickly, they struggled to comprehend what Pachacuti had achieved. They were looking at it through European eyes, expecting conquest through superior military technology. But Pachacuti had discovered something far more powerful: how to make conquered peoples want to be Inca. The stage was now set for the greatest expansion in Andean history. Pachacuti's son, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, would inherit not just an empire, but a machine for creating empire, one that would not stop until it had swallowed the entire known world. 3. The Great Conquerors. In 1471, as Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui drew his final breath in the golden halls of Cusco, his empire stretched across 100,000 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. But for his son and chosen heir, this was not an empire. It was merely the beginning. Tupac Inca Yupanqui looked out from the mountain heights toward horizons that seemed to stretch into infinity, and he saw not barriers, but invitations. The young emperor who ascended the throne was cut from different cloth than his revolutionary father. Where Pachacuti had been the visionary who created the imperial system, Tupac Inca would prove to be its most ruthless and efficient implementer. He possessed a military mind that could envision campaigns spanning years and covering thousands of miles, combined with an administrative genius that could organize the logistics to make such campaigns possible. His first target was audacious beyond imagination: the Kingdom of Chimer, rulers of the entire Peruvian coast. For over 500 years, the Chimu people had built the largest empire in pre-Columbian South America, their capital at Chanchan housing over 100,000 people in a maze of palaces, temples, and workshops that sprawled across 38 square miles. The Chimu were everything the Inca were not. Where the Inca drew their power from the mountains and the sacred forces of earth and stone, the Chimu commanded the sea and the fertile river valleys that cut through the coastal desert. Their metallurgy was legendary, gold work so exquisite it seemed to capture sunlight itself. Their textiles were prized throughout the Andes. Their irrigation systems had turned barren desert into a garden paradise. But most importantly, they controlled the coast, the trade routes that connected the Andes to the outside world, the fishing grounds that fed millions, the harbors where merchants from as far away as Mexico came to trade. For the Inca Empire to truly dominate the Andes, the Chimu Kingdom had to fall. The campaign that followed would become the template for Inca conquest. Tupac Inca didn't simply march his army to the coast and lay siege to Chan Chan. Instead, he spent 2 years in meticulous preparation, gathering intelligence, securing supply lines, and most crucially, exploiting the fault lines within Chimu society. The Inca had perfected the art of psychological warfare. They understood that every empire contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. Ethnic tensions, economic inequalities, religious differences. Tupac Inca's agents worked for months to identify local chiefs who chafed under Chimu rule, ethnic groups who felt oppressed, regions that had been recently conquered and still harbored resentment. When the Inca army finally descended from the mountains in 1470, they came not as foreign invaders, but as liberators. Entire provinces switched sides before a single battle was fought. The Chimu found themselves fighting not just the Inca, but their own former subjects who saw in Tupac Inca a chance to overthrow their oppressors. The siege of Chan Chan lasted months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Cut off from their allies, surrounded by enemies, facing an army that seemed to grow larger with each passing day, the Chimu ruler Menchacaman finally sued for peace. But Tupac Inca's terms were not those of a conqueror. They were those of an absorber. Menchacaman was taken to Cusco, not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest, married into the Inca royal family, and given a palace befitting his former status. His son was educated alongside Inca princes, learning the arts of government that would allow him to rule his homeland as an Inca governor. The Chimu nobility found themselves with new titles, new responsibilities, and new opportunities for advancement within the imperial system. This was the genius of Inca imperialism. They didn't destroy what they conquered, they improved it. Chimu metallurgists found themselves with access to gold and silver from across the empire. Chimu administrators discovered career paths that could take them to the far corners of the known world. The coastal irrigation systems were expanded and connected to highland agriculture in ways that increased productivity for everyone. Within a decade of conquest, many Chimu considered themselves proudly Inca. Their gods were incorporated into the imperial pantheon. Their festivals became part of the imperial calendar. Their children learned Quechua while still speaking their ancestral tongues. The conquest of Chimer was complete not when the last warrior surrendered, but when the last child born under Inca rule could no longer imagine any other way of life. But Tupac Inca was far from finished. The conquest of the coast was merely the first movement in a symphony of expansion that would consume the next 22 years of his reign. To the north, he pushed into the cloud forests of the Amazon, establishing fortified settlements among peoples who had never submitted to any authority beyond their village chiefs. The campaigns in the Amazon were unlike anything the Inca had attempted before. Here, their massive armies and sophisticated logistics were more hindrance than help. The enemy was not organized kingdoms, but scattered tribes who melted into the forest at the first sign of imperial forces, only to emerge days later to attack supply lines with poisoned arrows and wooden spears. Yet even here, Tupac Inca found ways to adapt. He established a network of fortified outposts connected by cleared paths that allowed rapid communication and reinforcement. He recruited local guides and translators who could navigate the cultural as well as physical landscape of the forest. Most importantly, he offered something the forest peoples had never had: access to highland products like metals and textiles in exchange for exotic goods like feathers, medicinal plants, and tropical foods. To the south, the challenges were different, but no less daunting. Here lay the Altiplano, the high plateau around Lake Titicaca, home to powerful confederations of herders and farmers who had been independent for centuries. The Lapaka controlled vast flocks of llamas and alpacas that provided wool for the finest textiles in the Andes. The Kala commanded strategic trade routes between the highlands and the lowlands. These were not peoples who could be conquered by force alone. They commanded territories so vast that occupying them would require entire armies, and their herds could simply be driven away from any advancing force. Tupac Inca's solution was characteristically innovative. He made himself indispensable. Inca engineers began constructing roads across the Altiplano that connected markets which had never been linked before. Inca administrators organized trade fairs where herders could exchange their products for goods from across the empire. Inca agricultural specialists introduced new varieties of potatoes and quinoa that could thrive at even higher altitudes. The transformation was remarkable. Within a generation, the Altiplano had become one of the most economically integrated regions of the empire. Local chiefs found that their wealth and influence had increased dramatically under Inca rule. Their children were educated in Cusco and returned home as imperial administrators. Their religious specialists were trained in the great temples and came back as priests of both local gods and Inti. But it was to the far south that Tupac Inca would achieve his most remarkable conquests. Beyond the great desert of Atacama, in the fertile valleys of what is now Chile, lived peoples who had never even heard of the Inca. The Mapuche were fierce warriors who had resisted every attempt at conquest for centuries. The Diaguita controlled rich mining regions that could provide the empire with copper and precious metals. The logistics alone were staggering. To campaign in Chile meant marching armies across 1,000 miles of some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, through deserts where water was more precious than gold, across mountain passes where the air was so thin that men collapsed from exhaustion, along coastal routes where fog could hide entire armies. Yet Tupac Inca's forces made this journey not once, but repeatedly over the course of a decade. They established supply depots in the desert, built roads across seemingly impassable mountains, and created a communication network that could coordinate operations across distances that would challenge modern militaries. The resistance they encountered was fierce. The Mapuche, in particular, proved to be formidable opponents who understood their homeland far better than any invading force ever could. They fought a guerrilla war that stretched Inca resources to their limits, attacking supply convoys, ambushing isolated garrisons, and melting away into forests and mountains whenever the main Inca army approached. But Tupac Inca had learned patience from his father's campaigns. He didn't seek quick victories, he sought permanent transformation. Slowly, methodically, he built a network of fortified settlements that could sustain themselves indefinitely. He recruited local allies who were tired of constant warfare and promised them peace and prosperity under Inca rule. Most importantly, he demonstrated the benefits of imperial citizenship. Inca engineers introduced new agricultural techniques that increased crop yields. Inca administrators organized labor in ways that made massive construction projects possible. Inca priests taught new ceremonies that seemed to bring better weather and more abundant harvests. By the time Tupac Inca died in 1493, the empire stretched from modern-day Colombia to central Chile, over 2,500 miles from north to south. It encompassed every major ecological zone in South America, from tropical rainforests to high-altitude deserts, from coastal fishing villages to mountain mining communities. Over 10 million people in 100 different ethnic groups called themselves subjects of the Inca. But the greatest test still lay ahead. Tupac Inca's son, Huayna Capac, would inherit not just an empire, but an empire that had reached the limits of what could be governed from a single center. The very success of Inca expansion was creating problems that no amount of administrative genius could solve. The empire was simply becoming too large to manage. Messages that had once taken days to travel between Cusco and the frontiers now took weeks. Regional governors, separated from the capital by thousands of miles of difficult terrain, were beginning to act more like independent rulers than imperial administrators. The costs of maintaining armies and administrators across such vast distances were straining even the Inca economic system. Huayna Capac would spend most of his 34-year reign trying to solve these problems, but his solutions would create new ones. His decision to establish a second capital at Quito, closer to the northern frontiers, made administrative sense but raised uncomfortable questions about the unity of the empire. His long campaigns in the north, sometimes lasting years, meant that he was often more of a legendary figure than a present ruler to most of his subjects. Most ominously, his prolonged absences from Cusco meant that the succession, always a delicate matter in an empire ruled by divine kings, became increasingly uncertain. When death finally claimed him in 1527, probably from a disease that had arrived with the first Spanish expeditions, he left behind an empire at the height of its power, but also at the beginning of its most dangerous crisis. 4. Engineering an empire. Imagine trying to govern an empire that stretches the length of a continent without a single-wheeled vehicle, without iron tools, without horses or oxen to carry your burdens. Imagine coordinating the movement of armies and supplies across terrain so challenging that modern engineers still marvel at the audacity of those who dared to build roads here. This was the reality facing Inca engineers, and their solution would become one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. The Capac Nan, the Great Road or Beautiful Road, was more than a transportation network. It was the nervous system of an empire, the arteries through which flowed not just people and goods, but information, culture, and the very essence of Inca civilization. When completed, this system would span over 25,000 miles, longer than the distance around the Earth at the equator. But calling it a single road is like calling the internet a single computer. The Capac Nan was actually an integrated network of two main highways running parallel along the spine of South America, one following the coast, another threading through the mountains, connected by hundreds of lateral roads that bridged every conceivable type of terrain. The Highland Route alone was an engineering marvel that defied every law of common sense. It crossed 37 major rivers, climbed over passes at altitudes exceeding 16,000 feet where the air is so thin that unacclimatized travelers collapse from oxygen deprivation, and maintained consistent grades across terrain so vertical that in many places the road became a staircase carved directly into living rock. Consider the magnitude of this achievement. Inca engineers were building roads at altitudes where modern highways fear to venture, in conditions where a single miscalculation could send workers plummeting thousands of feet to their deaths. They did this without surveying instruments more sophisticated than hanging weights and water levels, without explosives to clear obstacles, without any machinery more complex than bronze crowbars and stone hammers. Yet somehow, they achieved gradients that rarely exceeded 6%, gentler than many modern highways. They built retaining walls that have survived 5 centuries of earthquakes, floods, and landslides. They created drainage systems so effective that sections of the road remain perfectly functional today, requiring no maintenance despite centuries of abandonment. The secret lay not in any single innovation, but in a systematic approach to engineering that integrated human labor on an unprecedented scale. When Inca engineers encountered an obstacle, a raging river, a vertical cliff face, a stretch of unstable soil, they didn't try to overcome it with technology. They overwhelmed it with organization. Take the bridge-building crews. The Inca built over 200 suspension bridges, some spanning chasms more than 150 feet wide. These were not crude rope bridges, but sophisticated engineering marvels woven from carefully prepared grass fibers into cables stronger than steel. The main cables of the bridge over the Apurimac River were as thick as a man's torso and required the labor of over 1,000 people to construct. But here's what made the Inca system unique. These bridges weren't built once and forgotten. Every year, entire communities would gather for the ritual reconstruction of their local bridge. It was part religious ceremony, part engineering project, part social celebration. The bridge became a living symbol of community cooperation and imperial unity. The Quechua Bridge, still reconstructed annually using traditional techniques, gives us a glimpse of what this process involved. For 3 days, families from 4 communities gather to harvest the necessary grass, prepare the fibers, and weave the new bridge while the old one is carefully dismantled. The entire process is governed by ancient rituals and overseen by master bridge builders whose knowledge has been passed down through generations. But the roads themselves were only part of the system. Every 15 to 20 miles along the major routes stood a tambo, a way station that functioned as hotel, restaurant, supply depot, and administrative center all rolled into one. These weren't simple rest stops, but sophisticated installations capable of housing and feeding armies numbering in the thousands. The tambo at Huánuco Pampa covered nearly 500 acres and could accommodate 15,000 people. It contained over 4,000 structures, including royal residences, ceremonial platforms, workshops for textile production, massive storehouses, and even facilities for brewing chicha beer on an industrial scale. Archaeological evidence suggests that some tambos maintained supplies sufficient to last several years, ensuring that imperial forces could operate far from their home bases indefinitely. The storehouses, or kalkas, were marvels of preservation technology. Built with sophisticated ventilation systems that maintained constant temperature and humidity, they could preserve food for decades. Freeze-dried potatoes, called chuno, could last up to 50 years when properly stored. Quinoa, beans, and maize were kept in quantities that could feed entire regions through years of crop failure. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the road system was the communication network it supported. The Chasca runners, professional messengers who spent their entire lives training for speed and endurance, could carry messages across the empire faster than any horse-based system. Operating in relays, with fresh runners taking over every few miles, they could transport information from Cusco to Quito, a distance of over 1,200 miles, in just 5 days. These weren't just athletic achievement. They were feats of human logistics that enabled real-time governance across continental distances. A rebellion in the far north could be reported to Cusco, and imperial troops could be dispatched to deal with it faster than the rebels could organize their resistance. Economic crises could be addressed with emergency supplies before they became famines. The empire could react to events faster than its enemies could plan them. The construction techniques used to build this system remain mysterious for centuries. How do you quarry, transport, and precisely fit stones weighing up to 200 tons without wheels, without iron tools, without draft animals larger than llamas? Recent experimental archaeology has begun to provide answers, and they're even more impressive than the mysteries. Inca engineers understood leverage, friction, and mechanical advantage in ways that allowed them to multiply human strength by factors that seem impossible. They used timber frames and bronze crowbars to create fulcrums that could shift massive blocks. They built ramps and used rollers made from specially prepared logs. They employed techniques for splitting stone along natural fracture lines that could shape granite with precision rivaling modern machinery. But their greatest innovation was organizational. The MITA labor system could mobilize tens of thousands of workers for a single project. But more importantly, it could coordinate their efforts with mathematical precision. Workers were organized in groups based on the decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with its own supervisors and specialized tasks. The result was human machinery operating on a scale that had never been seen before and would never be seen again. When Spanish conquistadors first witnessed these construction projects in operation, they compared them to ant colonies, not as an insult, but in amazement at the level of coordination achieved. The architectural achievements this system made possible continue to astonish visitors today. Machu Picchu, perched impossibly on a mountain ridge 8,000 feet above sea level, represents the pinnacle of Inca engineering and aesthetic achievement. Every stone in its construction had to be quarried from distant locations and transported up nearly vertical mountain faces using only human labor and ingenuity. But Machu Picchu was more than just a technical achievement. It was a philosophical statement. Here, Inca architects achieved perfect harmony between human construction and natural landscape. Buildings seemed to grow from the living rock itself. Agricultural terraces follow the natural contours of the mountainside so perfectly that they appear to be geological features rather than human constructions. The water management system at Machu Picchu demonstrates Inca hydraulic engineering at its finest. A single spring provides water for the entire complex through a system of channels and fountains that maintains consistent flow and pressure across multiple elevation levels. After 500 years of abandonment, this system still functions perfectly, supplying clean water to the terraces and ceremonial baths exactly as its designers intended. Similar feats of engineering can be found throughout the former empire. At Ollantaytambo, massive stone terraces create a stairway to the sky that serves both defensive and agricultural purposes. At Pisac, terraces carved into near-vertical mountainsides created farmland where none should have been possible. At Choqquequirau, entire mountain faces were transformed into productive agricultural landscapes that could support thousands of people. The agricultural innovations were perhaps even more important than the architectural ones. Inca engineers didn't just build roads and cities. They rebuilt the landscape itself. Through terracing, they created over 2.5 million acres of new farmland on previously unusable mountain slopes. Through raised field systems called waro-waro, they turned swampy areas around Lake Titicaca into the most productive agricultural land in South America. These weren't simple farming plots, but sophisticated microclimates that could regulate temperature, conserve water, and prevent soil erosion. The stone retaining walls absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, protecting crops from frost damage. The terrace design prevented erosion even during the heaviest rains. The irrigation systems could distribute water with precision that ensured every plant received exactly the amount it needed. Modern agricultural scientists studying these systems have found that Inca terraces can produce crop yields 40% higher than conventional farming methods, while using 50% less water and requiring no chemical fertilizers. 5 centuries after their construction, many of these terraces are being restored and brought back into production because they remain superior to modern alternatives. The urban planning that governed Inca cities was equally sophisticated. Cusco, the imperial capital, was laid out according to cosmological principles that reflected Inca understanding of their place in the universe. The city was designed in the shape of a puma, the sacred animal of the Inca, with the fortress of Sacsayhuaman forming its head and the confluence of rivers marking its tail. But this wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. The puma's shape allowed for optimal drainage, with water flowing naturally from the head to the tail of the city. The street layout created natural channels for both water and wind, keeping the city clean and comfortable even during the rainy season. The central plaza, Huaca was positioned at the exact center of the Tawantinsuyu, the symbolic and literal navel of the known world. What the Inca achieved through engineering was more than just impressive construction. They created a physical manifestation of their vision of cosmic order. Every road, every building, every terrace was positioned according to principles that integrated human needs with natural forces and divine requirements. They built not just an empire, but a harmonious relationship between civilization and nature that sustained millions of people without environmental degradation. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered these achievements, they struggled to understand how such things were possible. Some concluded that they must have been built by giants or with supernatural assistance. Others claimed that the devil himself had aided the Inca in their constructions. It was easier for them to believe in magic than to accept that indigenous Americans had achieved engineering feats that surpassed anything in contemporary Europe. 5. The Inca state, government, and society. In the heart of Cusco, where the morning sun first touched the sacred walls of Coricancha, sat a man who was both human and divine, mortal and eternal, ruler and god. The Sapa Inca, the only Inca, embodied a form of government so sophisticated that it could coordinate the lives of 10 million people across 2,500 miles of the most challenging terrain on Earth, yet so personal that every subject felt a direct connection to their divine ruler. This was not merely absolute monarchy as Europeans understood it. The Sapa Inca was literally considered a child of Inti, the sun god, making his authority not just political but cosmic. When he spoke, the very universe listened. When he moved, reality itself shifted to accommodate his divine will. His saliva was collected in golden vessels because even his bodily fluids were sacred. His discarded clothing was burned in ceremony because no mortal could touch what had adorned the body of a god. Yet this divine king ruled through one of the most practical and efficient administrative systems ever devised. The genius of Inca government lay not in mystical authority alone, but in its ability to translate cosmic order into earthly organization that actually worked. At the apex of this system stood the royal family, the Panica, direct descendants of previous Sapa Incas who formed a hereditary nobility that managed the empire's most crucial functions. But unlike European nobility, Inca royalty was not a leisure class. They were working administrators whose divine blood came with divine responsibilities. The emperor's brothers and sons served as the four Apis, regional governors who ruled the four quarters of Tawantinsuyu with nearly absolute authority. These were not ceremonial positions, but demanding jobs that required constant travel, military leadership, and administrative expertise. An Apu might spend years campaigning on distant frontiers, then return to Cusco to personally report on everything from crop yields to ethnic tensions in his quarter. Below the Apis, a carefully structured hierarchy of nobles administered provinces, districts, and local communities. The Takrikak governed provinces of roughly 40,000 people. The Hunakak managed groups of 10,000. The Pichkawarankaak oversaw units of 5,000. The Warnkakak led groups of 1,000. And so on down through Piskakakamayak, 500, Pakakakakamayak, 100, and Chunkakamiak, 10, until every family in the empire had a direct administrative connection to the throne. This decimal system wasn't just elegant mathematics, it was revolutionary social engineering. By organizing society into groups of mathematically predictable size, the Inca could calculate with precision exactly how much tribute each community could provide, how many workers could be mobilized for projects, how much food would be needed to sustain armies in the field. But the true foundation of Inca society wasn't the imperial hierarchy. It was the Alu, the extended family group that formed the basic unit of Andean social organization. An Alu might include anywhere from 30 to 500 families who trace their descent to a common ancestor, shared ownership of land and animals, and maintained collective responsibility for each other's welfare. The Alu was more than just a kinship group. It was a complete social security system. If a family's crops failed, the Alu fed them. If a father died, the Alu raised his children. If elderly members could no longer work, the Alu cared for them. No one could fall through the cracks because everyone belonged to a group that was collectively responsible for their welfare. This system created a form of social insurance that European visitors would not see in their own societies for centuries. The Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon wrote with amazement about Inca communities where no one who was lazy or tried to live by the work of others was tolerated. Yet no one lacked food or clothing, and no one went hungry as long as there was food in the storehouses. The Inca achieved this through the MITA system, perhaps the most sophisticated labor organization in human history. Every able-bodied male between the ages of 18 and 50 owed the state a portion of his time each year. But this wasn't simple taxation or forced labor. It was citizenship made tangible. The MITA worker wasn't a slave or a serf. He was a citizen performing his civic duty, and the state had obligations to him just as he had obligations to the state. During his period of MITA service, the government provided not just his food and housing, but also supplied his family back home. If he was injured while working on state projects, the community was required to care for him for life. If he died, his family received permanent support from local storehouses. The projects accomplished through MITA labor stagger the imagination. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman required 20,000 workers laboring for over 50 years. The road from Cusco to Quito employed 200,000 people over 2 decades. The agricultural terraces that fed the empire represented the combined labor of millions of workers over generations. Yet the system was designed to minimize disruption to local communities. MITA's service was rotational. Workers from any given alum might serve for a few months every 3 or 4 years. The timing was coordinated with agricultural cycles so that communities weren't deprived of labor during crucial planting or harvest seasons. And the work was often performed close to home, allowing workers to maintain contact with their families and communities. The Inca understood something that many later civilizations would forget, that the strength of an empire lies not in its ability to exploit its people, but in its ability to organize their willing cooperation. A MITA worker wasn't being forced to build roads. He was participating in the creation of a civilization that would benefit his children and grandchildren. This principle extended to the empire's approach to conquered peoples. Rather than imposing uniform culture across their domains, the Inca practiced what modern scholars call indirect rule. Local chiefs who submitted peacefully were confirmed in their positions, allowed to maintain their traditional customs, and even encouraged to continue speaking their native languages alongside the imperial tongue of Quechua. The Caracas, local hereditary leaders, became the crucial link between imperial administration and local communities. They collected tribute, organized MITA labor, and served as judges in local disputes, but they did so according to both imperial law and local custom. This created a form of cultural federalism that allowed the empire to maintain unity while respecting diversity. Religious tolerance was similarly pragmatic. Conquered peoples were required to acknowledge Inti as the supreme deity and to participate in imperial ceremonies, but they were also encouraged to maintain their traditional gods and rituals. Local deities were often adopted into the imperial pantheon, creating a religious system that could accommodate hundreds of different spiritual traditions. The most powerful tool of integration was education. The sons of local nobles were brought to Cusco to study in the Yachahuasi, the House of Learning, where they received 4 years of intensive training in Quechua language, Inca history, imperial law, and administrative techniques. When they returned home as adults, they carried with them not just imperial knowledge, but imperial identity. These young men became natural bridges between their local communities and the imperial system. They could speak to their people in their native tongue about local concerns, but they could also communicate with imperial administrators in Quechua about broader policy issues. Within a generation, the empire had created a class of local leaders who were genuinely bicultural, equally comfortable in their ancestral villages and in the corridors of imperial power. The women's education system was equally sophisticated. The Aklawasi, houses of the chosen women, selected girls from across the empire based on beauty, intelligence, and manual skill. These young women received training in textile production, food preparation, religious ceremony, and administrative record-keeping. Some became priestesses, others married into the nobility, and still others served as administrators in their own right. This wasn't simply a system for producing wives for the elite. It was a mechanism for creating a class of skilled professional women who could manage the complex domestic economy that supported imperial administration. The finest textiles in the empire were produced in the Aklawasi. The chicha beer that lubricated imperial ceremonies was brewed under their supervision. The Quipu records that tracked imperial statistics were often maintained by women trained in these institutions. Social mobility within this system was limited but real. Outstanding military service could elevate a commoner to noble status. Exceptional administrative ability could lead to appointments far from one's birthplace. Marriage across ethnic lines was not just permitted, but encouraged as a way of binding different groups to the imperial system. The most successful example of this integration was the incorporation of the Chancas, the very people who had almost conquered Cusco in Pachacuty's youth. Within 2 generations of their defeat, Chanca nobles served as some of the empire's most trusted administrators. Chanca soldiers formed elite units in the imperial army. Chanca craftsmen produced some of the finest metalwork and textiles in the empire. This transformation from enemy to citizen to imperial elite demonstrates the genius of Inca political organization. They understood that true conquest wasn't about defeating your enemies. It was about making them no longer want to be your enemies. The economic system that supported this political structure was equally innovative. The Inca operated what economists would recognize as a command economy, but one based on reciprocity rather than coercion. Land was divided into 3 categories: community land that fed local populations, state land that supported the government and military, and religious land that maintained the priesthood and ceremonies. But this wasn't a system of exploitation where peasants worked for distant landlords. Community members worked their own land first, then collectively worked state and religious lands as part of their civic and spiritual obligations. The produce from state land supported not just the elite, but also the massive storehouse system that provided insurance against famine and the workshops that produced goods for redistribution throughout the empire. The result was an economy that could mobilize resources on a continental scale while maintaining local prosperity. Archaeological evidence suggests that nutrition and health among common people actually improved under Inca rule, as the imperial system provided both security and access to goods from across the known world. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered this system in operation, they struggled to understand how it worked. They were looking for kings and nobles who owned land and peasants who served them, but what they found was something unprecedented in their experience: a government that actually seemed to serve its people's welfare. Pedro Cieza de Leon wrote, "I believe that nowhere in the world has such a government been seen where people were so well provided for." Even Vasco de Contreras, hardly sympathetic to indigenous peoples, admitted that in all the land, one could not find a single person who lacked food, clothing, or a home, even though they had neither money nor markets. 6. Culture, religion, and daily life. Every morning across the Inca Empire, as the first light of Inti touched the highest peaks of the Andes, millions of people turned their faces eastward and raised their hands in greeting to their divine father. This was not mere ritual. It was the daily reaffirmation of a cosmic relationship that defined every aspect of Inca existence. For in their world, the boundary between the sacred and the mundane, between the spiritual and the practical, simply did not exist. Religion was not something the Inca did on special occasions. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, like the golden threads in their finest textiles. When a farmer planted his crops, he was participating in a sacred act of fertility. When a mason fitted stones together, he was creating a temple to cosmic order. When a messenger ran along the great roads, he was serving not just the emperor, but the sun god himself. At the center of this cosmic worldview stood Inti, the sun god, whose divine light brought life to the world and whose sun ruled as Sapa Inca. But Inti was not a jealous god demanding exclusive worship. The Inca universe was populated by a vast pantheon of deities, each governing different aspects of existence, each deserving reverence and offerings. Mama Quilla, the moon goddess, watched over women and the calendar of festivals. Alapa, the thunder god, brought the rains that fed the crops. Pachamama, the earth mother, provided the soil that sustained all life. Viracocha, the creator god, had shaped the world from primordial chaos. Each mountain peak was an APU, a sacred spirit deserving respect. Each spring was a holy place where the water spirits dwelt. This wasn't abstract theology, but practical spirituality that guided daily decisions. Before planting, farmers would consult the priests about which ceremonies would ensure Pachamama's blessing. Before beginning a journey, travelers would leave offerings at mountain shrines to gain the protection of the APU. Before starting construction, architects would perform rituals to ensure the building stones would be happy in their new positions. The most spectacular expression of this religious worldview came during the great festivals that punctuated the Inca calendar. Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, transformed Cusco into a stage for one of the most magnificent ceremonies ever created. For 3 days in June, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, the entire empire celebrated the renewal of their divine father's strength. Imagine the scene: 100,000 people gathered in the Great Plaza of Cusco, their clothing a riot of color representing every province of the empire. The Sapa Inca himself, adorned in robes of the finest vicuña wool interwoven with gold thread, would raise a golden cup of chicha beer to greet the rising sun. As the first rays touched the imperial standard, a roar would rise from the assembled multitude that could be heard for miles. The ceremony that followed combined theater, religious ritual, and political pageantry on a scale that European visitors could barely comprehend. Representatives from every ethnic group in the empire would present their finest products to the sun god. Textiles of impossible intricacy, metalwork that seemed to capture light itself, foods and beverages from every ecological zone in South America. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Inti Raymi was its democratic character. For these 3 days, social hierarchies were temporarily suspended. Commoners could approach the Sapa Inca directly with petitions. Regional chiefs could challenge imperial policies in open debate. The festival became a safety valve that allowed tensions to be expressed and grievances to be addressed before they became rebellions. The religious calendar included dozens of such festivals throughout the year, each timed to agricultural cycles and astronomical events. Capac Raymi in December celebrated the summer solstice and the coming of age of young nobles. Situa in September was a purification ceremony that cleansed the capital of disease and evil influences. Each month brought ceremonies that reinforced the connection between cosmic order and earthly prosperity. These weren't just public spectacles, but intimate family observances that bound individuals to the larger cosmic community. In homes across the empire, families maintained their own shrines where they honored their ancestors, made daily offerings, and sought guidance for personal decisions. The mummified remains of deceased family members were treated as active participants in household affairs, consulted on important matters, and included in family celebrations. This reverence for ancestors created a form of historical consciousness that permeated Inca society. The past wasn't something that had ended. It was alive and present, offering wisdom and demanding respect. Royal mummies participated in state ceremonies, their words interpreted by priests who spoke for them. These deceased rulers maintained their own households, their own lands, their own retainers who served them as if death were merely another form of life. The education system that transmitted this cultural knowledge was as sophisticated as any in the ancient world. In the Yachahuasi of Cusco, young nobles received 4 years of intensive training that would prepare them to govern an empire. The curriculum was remarkably broad: history and law, poetry and music, astronomy and mathematics, military strategy and diplomatic protocol. The first year focused on Quechua language and literature. Students memorized epic poems that could take days to recite in full, learning not just the words but the complex rhythms and melodies that turned history into song. These weren't simple stories but sophisticated historical records that preserved precise information about genealogies, territorial boundaries, and legal precedents. The second year introduced students to Quipu, the knotted string system that served as the empire's primary method of record-keeping. Modern scholars are only beginning to understand the complexity of this system. What appears to be simple knots in colored strings actually encoded sophisticated mathematical, historical, and administrative information with precision that rivals written records. A single quipu might contain census data for an entire province, including not just population numbers, but details about age distribution, occupation, tribute obligations, and military service records. Master Quipukamaic could read these devices like Europeans read books, extracting specific information with remarkable speed and accuracy. Recent computer analysis has revealed that Quipu may have been capable of recording narrative information as well as numerical data. Some scholars believe that epic poems, historical chronicles, and even philosophical treatises were encoded in these knotted strings, making them a form of three-dimensional writing that encoded information in ways no other culture ever achieved. The third year of education focused on religion and ceremony. Students learned the complex rituals that maintained cosmic harmony, the astronomical observations that guided agricultural cycles, and the diplomatic protocols that governed relations between different ethnic groups. They studied the properties of medicinal plants, the techniques of divination, and the arts of persuasion that could prevent conflicts before they became wars. The fourth year was devoted to practical administration. Students were assigned to work with experienced governors, learning firsthand how to manage provincial economies, coordinate MITA labor projects, and resolve disputes between communities. By graduation, these young men possessed knowledge that would allow them to govern territories larger than most European kingdoms. But education wasn't limited to the nobility. Every Alu maintained its own schools where children learned the skills necessary for productive citizenship. Boys learned agricultural techniques, craft specializations, and basic military training. Girls learned textile production, food processing, and household management. Both sexes learned the songs, dances, and stories that preserve their community's cultural identity. The textile arts, in particular, represented one of the highest forms of cultural expression in Inca society. Weaving was considered a sacred act, and the finest textiles were reserved for religious ceremonies and diplomatic gifts. The Cumbay cloth produced in the Aclawasi was so exquisite that Spanish conquistadors valued it more highly than gold. These textiles weren't just beautiful. They were historical documents woven in thread. Geometric patterns encoded information about family lineages, territorial boundaries, and astronomical observations. The colors came from dyes that required months of preparation and knowledge of chemical processes that wouldn't be understood in Europe for centuries. A single ceremonial robe might represent years of work by master weavers whose skills were passed down through generations of training. Music and dance were equally sophisticated art forms that served both entertainment and historical preservation. The empire maintained professional musicians and dancers who performed at state ceremonies, but every community also had its own musical traditions. Instruments included flutes made from condor bones, drums fashioned from llama hide, and bronze bells that could be heard for miles across mountain valleys. The dances told stories of creation myths and historical events, of seasonal cycles and divine interventions. Performed during festivals, these dances became living theater that educated while it entertained, preserving cultural memory in a form that was both beautiful and memorable. Daily life in this empire was governed by principles of reciprocity and balance that the Inca called Aini, the understanding that all relationships, whether between individuals, communities, or humans and nature, must be based on mutual obligation and respect. This wasn't just philosophical theory, but practical ethics that shaped everything from marriage customs to international diplomacy. In the home, Aini meant that family members supported each other through life's challenges. In the community, it meant that neighbors helped each other with agricultural work and contributed to collective projects. In the empire, it meant that rulers had obligations to their subjects, just as subjects had duties to their rulers. Even the relationship with nature was governed by reciprocity. Before taking anything from the earth, whether mining metals, harvesting crops, or quarrying stone, the Inca performed ceremonies to ask permission and offer compensation. They understood that human prosperity depended on maintaining balance with the natural world, and their entire economic system was designed to ensure that they took only what could be sustainably provided. This sophisticated worldview created a form of civilization that was both highly organized and deeply humane. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Inca achieved something that few societies have ever accomplished. They increased human prosperity while maintaining environmental sustainability. Their agricultural techniques actually improved soil fertility over time. Their population grew steadily without degrading their resource base. Their cities were clean, healthy, and beautiful. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Inca culture was its optimism. This was a civilization that believed in progress, that saw the future as something that could be shaped through human effort and divine cooperation. Their art celebrated abundance. Their architecture reached toward the sky. Their poetry sang of endless possibilities for human achievement. When Spanish chroniclers first encountered Inca society, many were struck by what they saw as the happiness of the people. Pedro Cieza de Leon wrote that in no other land had he seen people so content with their lot, so free from want, so secure in their possessions. Francisco López de Gamara noted that the Inca lived in great contentment and abundance, for they lacked nothing necessary for human life. This was the civilization that Spanish conquistadors encountered in 1532. Not a primitive society waiting to be civilized, but a sophisticated culture that had achieved levels of social organization, artistic achievement, and human welfare that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. It was a world where engineering served beauty, where governments served citizens, where religion celebrated life rather than threatening damnation. Yet within this very success lay the seeds of vulnerability. A society so well organized, so dependent on central coordination, so confident in its cosmic destiny, was perhaps unprepared for the chaos that would arrive with foreign diseases and alien ways of war. The very harmony that made Inca civilization so remarkable would make it tragically fragile when that harmony was shattered. 7. Seeds of destruction. In the year 1527, death came to the Inca Empire not with the clash of bronze weapons or the thunder of war drums, but with the silent whisper of invisible killers that traveled faster than any Chasca messenger, struck without warning, and left devastation that no army could have achieved. The greatest empire in the Americas was about to discover that its very perfection had made it vulnerable to forces beyond any human control. For over 3 decades, Huayna Capac had ruled as the most powerful man in the known world. His empire stretched from the Amazon rainforest to the Pacific Ocean, from the deserts of Chile to the cloud forests of Colombia. 10 million subjects in 100 different ethnic groups called him Father and God. Yet in his final years, this divine emperor faced problems that seemed to grow more intractable with each passing season. The northern frontier had become an endless bleeding wound that consumed armies and treasure without ever healing. The fierce Cambi people of Ecuador had been fighting Inca expansion for over a decade, their warriors proving as stubborn and resourceful as the mountain terrain they defended. Every victory seemed to lead only to another rebellion. Every conquered territory required permanent garrisons that could never be withdrawn. Huayna Capac had spent 20 years of his reign in the north, farther from Cusco than any Sapa Inca before him. He had established a second capital at Quito, built magnificent palaces and temples that rivaled those of the sacred city itself. But this very success raised uncomfortable questions that whispered through the corridors of noble houses. Could there be 2 centers of the universe? Could the Inca Empire have 2 navels? The emperor's prolonged absence from Cusco had created a dangerous precedent. For the first time in Inca history, an entire generation of nobles had grown to adulthood, seeing their divine ruler only as a distant figure whose command arrived through messengers rather than a living presence whose very breath could alter reality. The mystical bond between ruler and ruled, so carefully cultivated by previous emperors, was beginning to fray. Even more troubling were the reports filtering in from the edges of the known world. Strange pale-skinned men had been seen along the coasts, sailing in floating houses larger than any building. They possessed weapons that could kill at impossible distances and animals unlike anything in the Andean world. 4-legged beasts that could carry men at incredible speeds. Some of these strangers had even been captured and brought before provincial governors, babbling in incomprehensible languages about distant lands and foreign gods. Huayna Capac received these reports with a mixture of curiosity and concern that befitted a ruler whose ancestors had incorporated dozens of strange peoples into their empire. Perhaps these were simply another ethnic group to be conquered and civilized. Perhaps their unusual appearance and bizarre customs would make them valuable additions to the imperial collection of human diversity. But in 1524, something arrived that changed everything. It began in the coastal regions where the strange foreigners had been most active, a disease unlike anything the Inca had ever encountered. The victims developed fever, and terrible sores that covered their entire bodies. Most died within days. Those who survived were often left scarred and blind. Entire communities were wiped out so quickly that there was no one left to bury the dead. The disease spread with supernatural speed, following the very trade routes that had made the empire prosperous. From the coast, it climbed into the mountains. From the mountains, it descended into the Amazon basin. It seemed to travel faster than any human messenger, arriving in communities that had never seen a foreigner, striking down people who had never heard of the pale-skinned strangers from across the sea. Smallpox had arrived in the Americas, and the indigenous populations had no immunity to this old-world killer. What had been merely a childhood disease in Europe became an apocalyptic plague that would kill more people than all the wars in Inca history combined. Conservative estimates suggest that 30% of the population died in the first epidemic wave. Some regions lost 90% of their inhabitants within a decade. But the epidemic that began in 1524 carried away more than just lives. It destroyed the very foundations of imperial authority. When people prayed to Inti for protection and their families died anyway, when they made offerings to Pachamama and their crops withered, when they performed all the proper ceremonies and their children perished in agony, the cosmic order that had sustained the empire for generations suddenly seemed meaningless. Local shamans and wise women began to whisper that perhaps the traditional gods had been defeated by the deities of the pale strangers. Perhaps the diseases were divine punishment for some unknown transgression. Perhaps the end of the world foretold in ancient prophecies was finally at hand. The ideological unity that had made rapid conquest possible was cracking under pressure that no amount of administrative efficiency could address. In 1527, the epidemic reached Quito, and with it came the moment that would seal the empire's fate. Huayna Capac himself fell ill, along with his chosen heir, Prince Naninquiyuchi. Within days, both were dead, leaving the most powerful empire in the Americas without a clear succession for the first time in its history. The death of a Sapa Inca was always a traumatic event that required careful management. The emperor was not just a political leader, but a divine being whose death meant that the sun itself had temporarily withdrawn from the world. Elaborate ceremonies were required to ensure that his successor could claim the same cosmic authority that had legitimized imperial rule. But Huayna Capac's death came at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible place, under the worst possible circumstances. He died far from Cusco, surrounded by a court that was itself devastated by disease. The traditional succession rituals could not be properly performed. The noble councils that should have confirmed his successor were scattered across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. Even worse, the succession itself was unclear. Inca law required that the emperor choose his heir from among his sons, but did not specify which son or establish clear criteria for the choice. Huayna Capac had apparently selected Naninquiyuchi, but the prince had died before he could be formally invested. The emperor's other sons had equal claims to divine descent, but none had been publicly designated as the chosen successor. Into this vacuum stepped two princes who would tear the empire apart in their struggle for supremacy. Huáscar, whose name meant golden chain, was the legitimate heir according to traditional Inca customs. Born in Cusco to one of Huayna Capac's principal wives, raised in the sacred city, educated by the greatest teachers of the empire, he represented continuity with the glorious past. But in Quito stood Atahualpa, the turquoise rooster, son of a provincial princess who had caught the emperor's eye during his northern campaigns. Atahualpa had spent his youth not in the ceremonial halls of Cusco, but in the military camps of the frontier. He knew war as intimately as Huáscar knew ritual. Most crucially, he commanded the loyalty of the professional army that had spent decades conquering the northern territories. At first, both brothers seemed willing to share power. Atahualpa would rule the northern territories from Quito, while acknowledging Huáscar as the supreme Sapa Inca in Cusco. This arrangement might have worked if the empire had been healthy and prosperous, but the ongoing epidemic was creating crises that required immediate attention and unified command. provinces were reporting that local administrators had died faster than they could be replaced. Communities were abandoning their traditional territories and migrating to areas they believed might be safer from disease. The carefully maintained census records were becoming meaningless as entire population groups simply disappeared. The MITA labor system was breaking down as there weren't enough healthy workers to maintain essential infrastructure. Asterisk. In this atmosphere of crisis, every decision became a potential source of conflict between the two capitals. When Huáscar ordered population relocations to address labor shortages, Atahualpa's governors sometimes refused to comply, claiming they needed to protect their own territories. When Atahualpa redistributed resources to address local famines, Huáscar's administrators accused him of exceeding his authority. The breaking point came in 1529 when Huáscar demanded that Atahualpa come to Cusco to pay homage and formally acknowledge his subordinate status. For Atahualpa, this was an impossible demand. To leave the north would mean abandoning the army that was his only source of power. To go to Cusco would mean placing himself at the mercy of nobles who had never accepted his legitimacy. Asterisk. Backslash. When Atahualpa refused the summons, Huáscar declared him a rebel and ordered his arrest. When Huáscar's agents tried to seize him, Atahualpa's soldiers resisted. What had begun as a succession dispute exploded into full-scale civil war that would consume the empire for the next 3 years. The war that followed was unlike anything in Inca history. Previous conflicts had been about expanding the empire or suppressing regional rebellions. This was about the fundamental question of who had the right to rule the known world. Both sides fought with a desperation and brutality that shocked even veteran warriors who had participated in decades of frontier conflicts. Huáscar commanded the loyalty of the traditional Inca heartland and the resources of the most sacred cities in the empire. His forces included the royal guard units that had never known defeat and the provincial levies from regions that had been part of the empire for generations. But his armies were commanded by nobles whose military experience was limited to ceremonial warfare and regional pacification. Atahualpa's forces were smaller, but they were professionals who had spent their careers fighting the fierce tribes of the northern frontier. His generals, men like Rumiñahui, Quizquiz, and Calcucamac, had learned their trade in campaigns where tactical innovation meant the difference between life and death. Most importantly, they commanded the absolute loyalty of soldiers who had fought beside them for years. Asterisk. The Civil War raged across thousands of miles, devastating regions that had known peace for generations. The great roads that had been the empire's pride became corridors for advancing armies. The storehouses that had guaranteed food security were emptied to feed hungry soldiers. The administrative system that had coordinated the lives of millions broke down as governors chose sides or simply abandoned their posts. But the most devastating impact was psychological. For the first time in their history, the Inca were fighting other Inca. The cosmic order that had justified imperial expansion was being shattered by imperial civil war. If the children of Inti could wage war against each other, what did that say about the divine nature of Inca rule? If the empire could tear itself apart, how could it claim to represent cosmic harmony? The war reached its climax in 1532 at the Battle of Quapapan, where Atahualpa's northern veterans finally destroyed Huáscar's traditional forces. The aftermath was a bloodbath that eliminated much of the traditional Inca nobility. Huáscar was captured, humiliated, and imprisoned. His supporters were systematically hunted down and executed. Entire royal lineages that had ruled for generations were wiped out in a matter of months. Atahualpa's victory was complete, but it was also hollow. He now ruled an empire that had been devastated by 3 years of civil war and a decade of epidemic disease. The population had been reduced by perhaps half. The administrative system was in ruins. The ideological foundations of imperial rule had been shattered by the spectacle of divine brothers murdering each other for earthly power. Asterisk. Even worse, Atahualpa's methods of victory had alienated many of the groups he now needed to govern. His systematic elimination of the traditional nobility had created a power vacuum in the provinces. His reliance on northern military commanders had convinced many southern ethnic groups that they were now ruled by foreign conquerors rather than legitimate Inca authorities. The very efficiency of his victory had become a source of weakness. By November 1532, as Atahualpa established his court in the city of Cajamarca to celebrate his triumph and plan the reorganization of his empire, he commanded a territory larger than all of Europe, but controlled it through the loyalty of a single army and the fear of a traumatized population. It was at this moment of apparent triumph and actual vulnerability that news arrived of a new group of pale-skinned strangers who had landed on the coast. There were only 168 of them, fewer men than serve in a single company of Atahualpa's army. They possessed no territory, commanded no subjects, and seemed to represent no significant threat to an empire of 10 million people. Atahualpa's decision to meet with these strangers would prove to be the final catastrophe in a series of disasters that had been building for years. The diseases that had killed his father, the succession crisis that had torn apart the imperial family, the civil war that had shattered the empire's unity, all of these had created the conditions that would make the impossible conquest of the Americas not just possible, but inevitable. The seeds of destruction had been planted not by foreign enemies, but by the empire's own success. A system so large that it could not be effectively governed from a single center. A succession law so flexible that it could justify civil war. An ideology so dependent on divine authority that epidemic disease could shatter its foundations. A military so accustomed to victory that it could not imagine defeat by a force it outnumbered 60,000 to 1. The Inca Empire was about to discover that in the game of civilizations, it is not always the largest, strongest, or most sophisticated player who survives. Sometimes it is simply the one who happens to be standing when the music stops. 8. The Spanish arrival. Across 3,000 miles of uncharted ocean, driven by winds that had never filled European sails, came a force so small it should have been laughable, so outnumbered it should have been doomed, so audacious it should have been impossible. Yet these 168 men would achieve what no army in history had accomplished: the conquest of a continent in a single afternoon. Their story begins not with heroic destiny, but with the desperate ambitions of a man who had already failed twice to find his fortune in the New World. Francisco Pizarro was past 50 when he first glimpsed the coast of Peru, an advanced age for a conquistador in an era when most men were dead by 40. Born illegitimate in the hardscrabble region of Extremadura, he had spent his youth herding pigs for his father, never learning to read or write, never imagining that his name would be remembered by history. But he possessed something more valuable than literacy: an unshakable belief that God had reserved great things for those bold enough to seize them. Pizarro had arrived in the Americas in 1502, part of the great wave of Spanish colonization that followed Columbus's discoveries. For 30 years, he had participated in the bloody business of conquest that had subjugated the Caribbean islands and much of Central America. He had witnessed the fall of indigenous empires, seen cities of gold stripped bare, watched entire populations disappear under the twin assault of disease and exploitation. By 1524, he was a wealthy man by colonial standards, owner of a large estate near Panama City, master of hundreds of indigenous servants, a respected member of the Spanish colonial elite. But wealth was not enough for Francisco Pizarro. He had heard the stories filtering north from Peru, tales of an empire that made the Aztecs look like paupers, of cities where the very walls were covered in sheets of gold. The conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés had shown that even the mightiest indigenous civilizations could fall to small groups of determined Spaniards. In 1519, Cortés had landed in Mexico with just 600 men and within 2 years had toppled an empire that ruled over 15 million people. The impossible had become routine. The unthinkable had become profitable. Pizarro's first expedition to Peru in 1524 had been a disaster. Disease, starvation, and indigenous resistance had forced him to retreat after barely penetrating the northern coastline. His second attempt in 1526 went further but achieved little more than confirming the rumors of incredible wealth lying just beyond his reach. Most men would have given up. Pizarro began planning a third expedition. But this time, he would not go as a mere adventurer seeking quick plunder. This time, he would go as an official representative of the Spanish crown, with legal authority to conquer and colonize whatever lands he could claim. In 1529, he traveled to Spain to petition King Charles V for a capitulation, a contract that would make him governor and captain general of any territories he could conquer in Peru. The document he received, known as the Capitulation of Toledo, was one of the most extraordinary legal instruments in the history of European expansion. It granted Pizarro virtually unlimited authority over lands that Spain did not own, peoples it had never contacted, and resources it had never seen. He was authorized to conquer an empire, establish a government, distribute land grants, and levy taxes, all in the name of a king who lived 6,000 miles away and had never set foot in the Americas. The capitulation also revealed the three driving forces behind Spanish expansion: God, gold, and glory. Pizarro was commanded to spread the Christian faith among the indigenous peoples, to secure precious metals for the royal treasury, and to win honor and advancement for himself and his followers. These weren't necessarily compatible goals, but they were the motivations that would drive Spanish conquistadors to attempt the impossible. When Pizarro returned to Panama in 1530, he found a colonial society transformed by news of his royal commission. Men who had dismissed his earlier expeditions as the fantasies of an aging adventurer now competed for places in his company. The expedition that finally departed from Panama in January 1531 included some of the most experienced soldiers in the Americas, veterans of the conquest of Mexico and Central America who understood exactly what they were attempting. Yet by European standards, it was a pathetically small force. Pizarro's entire army consisted of 168 men, 62 horses, and a handful of cannons. To put this in perspective, a single Inca provincial governor commanded forces 10 times larger. The army that Atahualpa had used to win the Civil War numbered over 100,000 warriors. Pizarro was planning to conquer an empire with fewer men than it took to crew a large sailing ship. But these 168 men possessed advantages that no indigenous army could match. They carried steel weapons that could cut through bronze and wooden armor like paper. They rode horses, animals that had been extinct in the Americas for 10,000 years and which struck indigenous peoples as supernatural creatures that were half man, half beast. They possessed firearms that could kill at distances beyond the range of any indigenous weapon. Even more importantly, they carried diseases that would prove deadlier than all their weapons combined. Smallpox, typhus, measles, and influenza would spread wherever they went, killing indigenous peoples who had no immunity to Old World pathogens. The Spanish didn't even need to wage biological warfare deliberately. Their mere presence was enough to trigger demographic catastrophe. But perhaps their greatest advantage was psychological. The Spanish arrived at the perfect moment to exploit indigenous beliefs about the nature of the universe. Many Andean peoples had prophecies about the return of Viracocha, the creator god who had disappeared across the Western Ocean, promising to return someday. When pale-skinned, bearded men arrived from that same Western Ocean, riding supernatural animals and wielding thunder weapons, it was not unreasonable for indigenous peoples to wonder if the ancient prophecies were being fulfilled. The Spanish landing in 1532 was carefully planned to maximize these psychological advantages. Pizarro chose to disembark at Tumbes, the same city his scouts had visited during his second expedition. The local population had already been exposed to Spanish diseases and Spanish stories, creating an atmosphere of expectation and dread that preceded the conquistadors wherever they went. The small Spanish force that finally set foot on Peruvian soil was a remarkable collection of humanity. There were nobles seeking to restore family fortunes lost in European wars, commoners hoping to become lords of vast estates, priests determined to save indigenous souls from eternal damnation, and adventurers who simply couldn't resist the lure of the unknown. What united them was a shared conviction that God favored their enterprise and that their victory was therefore inevitable. Among them rode Hernando de Soto, a veteran of the conquest of Nicaragua who would serve as Pizarro's cavalry commander and chief diplomat. There was Hernando Pizarro, the conquistador's younger brother, whose education and noble bearing would prove crucial in negotiations with Inca aristocrats. Pedro de Candia, a Greek artilleryman whose cannons would terrorize indigenous warriors who had never heard gunpowder explode. But the most important member of the expedition was also the most invisible to later chroniclers. Felipillo, a young indigenous man who had been captured during Pizarro's second expedition and trained as an interpreter. He would serve as the crucial link between Spanish and Inca cultures, translating not just languages, but entire worldviews during the negotiations that would determine the fate of an empire. The Spanish advance into Peru was methodical and carefully calculated. Pizarro had learned from Cortez's example that the key to conquering indigenous empires was to secure the person of the ruler. Control the emperor, and you could command the empire through existing administrative structures. Kill or alienate the indigenous elite, and you would face endless guerrilla warfare that could bleed Spanish forces to death. As they marched inland from the coast, the Spanish encountered a landscape that both amazed and troubled them. The agricultural terraces that stepped up mountainsides represented engineering achievements that surpassed anything in contemporary Europe. The roads were better maintained than the highways of Spain. The cities were larger and cleaner than most European capitals, but they also encountered clear evidence of the civil war that had recently convulsed the empire. Burned settlements, abandoned terraces, and mass graves told the story of a civilization that had torn itself apart in fratricidal conflict. Local populations who should have united against foreign invaders instead viewed the Spanish as potential allies in settling old grievances against their neighbors. The Spanish were particularly struck by the efficiency of the Chascom messenger system. News of their arrival traveled faster than they could march, reaching Atahualpa's court days before the Spanish themselves appeared. This created both opportunities and dangers. It meant that Atahualpa would be expecting them, but it also meant that he would have time to prepare either a welcome or an ambush. As the Spanish climbed higher into the Andes, following the Great Road that led to Cajamarca, they entered a world that seemed increasingly supernatural. At altitudes where Europeans gasped for breath, indigenous peoples went about their daily business as if the thin air posed no problems. The landscape itself seemed impossible. Vertical terraces that should have collapsed under their own weight, suspension bridges that spanned chasms like spider webs, irrigation channels that carried water uphill through principles of engineering that the Spanish couldn't understand. But the most unsettling discovery was the wealth. In every settlement, even the smallest villages possessed gold and silver ornaments that would have made European nobles wealthy. The precious metals that drove Spanish expansion were so common in Peru that they were used for everyday utensils. If outlying provinces possessed such riches, what treasures must await in the imperial capital itself? By November 1532, the Spanish force was climbing the final approaches to Cajamarca, the provincial city where Atahualpa had established his court while consolidating his victory in the Civil War. Scouts reported that the Inca emperor was indeed present, along with an army that numbered in the tens of thousands. The entire imperial nobility had gathered to celebrate Atahualpa's triumph and plan the reorganization of the empire. Pizarro faced a moment of decision that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of an entire continent. He commanded 168 men facing an empire of 10 million people. His nearest reinforcements were thousands of miles away across hostile territory. His supply lines consisted of whatever his men could carry on their backs. By any rational calculation, he should have retreated to the coast and waited for additional forces. But Francisco Pizarro had not spent 30 years in the Americas to retreat at the moment of greatest opportunity. He had seen Cortés conquer the Aztecs through audacity and psychological warfare. He had studied the techniques that small groups of Europeans had used to dominate much larger indigenous populations. Most importantly, he understood that the very impossibility of his situation was also his greatest advantage. No one, neither Spanish ally nor indigenous enemy, could quite believe that 168 men would dare to challenge an empire. The sheer audacity of the attempt created a kind of paralysis among potential opponents who kept waiting for the conquistadors to reveal their real plan, their hidden allies, their secret weapons. By the time anyone realized that there was no hidden plan, it would be too late. Asterisk. On the evening of November 15th, 1532, Pizarro's expedition made camp on the hills overlooking Cajamarca. Below them stretched an imperial army that covered the valley floor like a living carpet. Cooking fires sparkled like stars in the gathering darkness. The sound of drums and flutes drifted up from celebrations that would continue through the night. Somewhere in that vast encampment sat Atahualpa, the most powerful man in the Americas, master of an empire that had never known defeat, ruler of territories that stretched beyond the horizon. Tomorrow, he would meet with the strange pale men who claimed to represent a distant king. It would be a diplomatic courtesy, perhaps leading to useful trade relations or interesting technological exchanges. Asterisk. What Atahualpa could not imagine was that within 24 hours, his empire would cease to exist as an independent power. What none of the millions of people sleeping peacefully in the valley below could foresee was that they were witnessing the last night of indigenous America. The encounter at Cajamarca would last only a few hours, but its consequences would echo through the centuries, reshaping not just the Americas but the entire world. The conquistadors slept fitfully that night, knowing that tomorrow would bring either the greatest victory in the history of European expansion or the most complete disaster. There would be no middle ground, no second chances, no retreat. Francisco Pizarro had gambled everything on a single throw of the dice. Tomorrow, the world would discover whether his faith in Spanish destiny was divine inspiration or deadly delusion. 9. The Trap at Cajamarca. History pivots on moments so brief they can be measured in heartbeats, yet so consequential they reshape the fate of continents. November 16th, 1532, dawned like any other day in the Inca Empire. Priests greeting Inti with morning ceremonies, Chasca messengers departing with the night's dispatches, nobles preparing for another day of imperial business. But before the sun reached its zenith, the largest empire in the Americas would cease to exist as an independent power, destroyed not by superior armies or brilliant strategy, but by a trap so audacious that its very impossibility made it irresistible. In his royal pavilion at the center of the vast Inca encampment, Atahualpa, Inca, rose to greet what would be the last morning of his freedom. The emperor who had just won the greatest civil war in Andean history, who commanded more soldiers than had ever been assembled under a single banner, who ruled territories larger than all of Europe, was preparing to meet with 168 foreigners as an act of imperial courtesy. Asterisk. The decision to meet the Spanish had been debated throughout the night by Atahualpa's war council. His generals, hardened veterans like Rumiñahui and Quizquiz, who had fought their way across thousands of miles to place him on the throne, urged caution. These pale strangers possessed unknown weapons and rode supernatural beasts. Better to surround them with overwhelming force, test their intentions, discover their weaknesses before committing the emperor's sacred person to any meeting. But Atahualpa had not conquered an empire by showing fear to anyone, especially not to a tiny band of foreigners who had approached his camp with all the diplomatic courtesy required of petitioners seeking audience with divinity. To refuse to meet them would suggest that the son of Inti feared mere mortals. To surround them with armies would imply that the emperor of Tawantinsuyu could not protect himself through the simple force of his divine presence. Asterisk. Besides, what threat could 168 men pose to an army of 80,000? Even if these strangers harbored hostile intentions, even if their weapons were as powerful as reports suggested, they were so completely outnumbered that resistance would be suicide. The mathematics of the situation were simple. If the Spanish meant harm, they would be annihilated before they could strike. If they came in peace, as their messages claimed, then meeting them would demonstrate the magnanimity appropriate to a divine ruler. The message that Atahualpa sent to the Spanish camp was a masterpiece of imperial diplomacy. He would receive their leader and a small delegation in the great plaza of Cajamarca at midday. It would be a formal audience, conducted according to the ancient protocols that governed meetings between the Inca and representatives of lesser powers. The Spanish would have the honor of witnessing the full splendor of imperial majesty, and in return, they would explain their purpose and present whatever tribute they had brought from their distant king, *. In the Spanish camp, Francisco Pizarro received this message with emotions that mixed elation with terror. This was exactly what he had hoped for, an opportunity to get close to the Inca emperor without having to fight through 80,000 warriors. But it was also a trap that could destroy his entire expedition if anything went wrong. Once he entered that plaza, surrounded by Inca forces, there would be no retreat, no second chances. The plan that Pizarro outlined to his men was breathtaking in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. They would not enter the plaza as supplicants seeking audience with a foreign ruler. They would enter as predators preparing to spring the greatest trap in the history of conquest. When the signal was given, they would seize Atahualpa himself, holding the emperor hostage to paralyze the vast army that surrounded them. It was a plan that required split-second timing, absolute coordination, and nerves of steel. A single mistake, a moment's hesitation, a failure of communication could result in the massacre of every Spanish soldier in Peru. But Pizarro had studied the conquest of Mexico, and he knew that indigenous armies, no matter how large, became helpless when their command structure was destroyed. Capture the emperor, and the empire would capture itself. The Spanish spent the morning of November 16th making their final preparations. Horses were fitted with leather armor that would turn aside bronze weapons. Steel swords were sharpened to edges that could cut through the finest Inca textiles like paper. Firearms were loaded with a ball and shot that would carry death across the plaza in clouds of smoke and flame. But the most crucial preparations were psychological. Every Spanish soldier understood that they were about to attempt something that had never been done in the history of warfare: the conquest of an empire in a single afternoon. They would succeed through audacity or die through overreach. There was no middle ground. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Atahualpa began his own preparations for the meeting. This would be more than a diplomatic encounter. It would be a demonstration of Inca power designed to awe the foreigners into submission. The emperor would appear in all the splendor that befitted a son of the sun god, surrounded by the finest nobles of the empire, carried on a litter that proclaimed his divine status to anyone with eyes to see. The procession that formed around Atahualpa's golden litter was a masterpiece of imperial theater. 5,000 warriors in ceremonial armor preceded the emperor, their bronze weapons gleaming in the mountain sunlight, their feathered standards rippling in the highland breeze. Behind them came the great nobles of the empire, each wearing robes that represented the finest textiles in the Americas, each carrying symbols of authority that commanded instant recognition throughout Tontinsio. The emperor himself was a vision of divine majesty that struck observers speechless. His robes were woven from vicuña wool, so fine it felt like silk, interwoven with threads of pure gold that caught and reflected every ray of sunlight. His crown was a fringe of red feathers from the sacred bird of Lake Titicaca, each one worth more than a Spanish soldier's annual pay. Golden ornaments adorned his ears, his neck, his arms, enough precious metal to fund a European war. But most impressive of all was the litter itself. A golden platform carried by 80 nobles whose privilege it was to bear the son of Inti across the earth. The litter was decorated with the feathers of tropical birds gathered from across the empire, with silver ornaments that tinkled like temple bells, with tapestries that told the story of Inca victories stretching back through generations of conquest. The Plaza of Cajamarca had been prepared as a stage for imperial majesty. The Spanish had been assigned a position at one end of the square, where they waited in the shadow of stone buildings that had housed Inca administrators for generations. As the imperial procession approached, the sound of drums and flutes filled the mountain air, accompanied by the voices of thousands of warriors chanting the traditional songs that announced the presence of divinity. At exactly midday, as the sun reached its zenith in the clear Andean sky, Atahualpa Inca entered the Plaza of Cajamarca. The sight that greeted him was underwhelming in the extreme. A few dozen pale-skinned men clustered in a corner of the square, their simple clothing a stark contrast to the magnificence that surrounded the emperor. Were the armies these strangers commanded? Were the tribute bearers carrying gifts appropriate for a divine ruler? Were the signs of respect that any civilized people would show in the presence of the son of Inti? The Spanish delegation that approached the imperial litter was led not by Pizarro himself, but by Friar Vicente de Valverde, a Dominican priest whose mission was to offer the Inca emperor one final opportunity to avoid bloodshed. In his hands, he carried a leather-bound Bible and a formal document known as the Requerimiento, a legal requirement that Spanish law demanded be read to any indigenous people before hostilities could begin. The Requerimiento was one of the most cynical documents in the history of European expansion. It informed indigenous peoples that God had granted dominion over the entire world to the Pope, who had in turn granted the Americas to the Spanish crown. Any people who refuse to acknowledge Spanish sovereignty and accept Christian conversion will be subject to war with fire and sword until they submitted or were destroyed. Through the interpreter Felipillo, Friar Valverde explained to Atahualpa that he must immediately acknowledge the supremacy of the Christian God, accept the authority of the Spanish king, and submit his empire to Spanish rule. In return, he would be allowed to continue governing his territories as a vassal of the Spanish crown. The alternative was total war that would end only with the complete destruction of Inca civilization. The emperor's reaction was one of incredulous amazement. How dare these presumptuous foreigners demand that the son of Inti submit to some distant king who had never set foot in Tawantinsuyu? How could they claim that their invisible god owned lands that had belonged to the Inca since the creation of the world? What possible authority could justify such preposterous demands? When Valverde offered him the Bible as proof of Spanish claims, Atahualpa examined it with the curiosity of a sophisticated ruler encountering an unfamiliar technology. He held it to his ear, apparently expecting it to speak with the voice of the Christian God. When it remained silent, he opened it and found only marks on paper that meant nothing to someone from civilization that preserved knowledge in knotted strings rather than written words. The exact sequence of events that followed remains disputed by historians, but the outcome was never in doubt. Whether Atahualpa threw the Bible to the ground in disgust, whether it fell from his hands accidentally, whether he simply set it aside as irrelevant to his concerns, the Spanish chose to interpret his treatment of their holy book as justification for immediate attack. Valverde's cry of come out, Christians, come at these enemy dogs who reject the things of God," was the signal Pizarro had been waiting for. From the buildings surrounding the plaza erupted Spanish soldiers who had been hidden for hours, their steel weapons gleaming, their battle cries echoing off the stone walls. At the same moment, Spanish cavalry charged from concealed positions, their horses seeming to fly across the plaza as their riders struck down anyone who stood in their way. The effect on the Inca forces was instantaneous and catastrophic. Warriors who had never seen horses before found themselves facing what appeared to be supernatural creatures that combined the speed of the wind with the fury of thunder. The sound of gunpowder weapons, the first firearms ever heard in the Andes, created panic that spread through the ranks faster than any weapon could strike. But the most devastating impact was psychological. This wasn't warfare as the Inca understood it. This was betrayal of the most fundamental laws governing relations between civilized peoples. Diplomatic meetings were sacred occasions protected by divine law. To attack during a peaceful conference was to violate the cosmic order that sustained the universe. Asterisk. The massacre that followed lasted less than 2 hours, but it destroyed an empire that had taken generations to build. Inca warriors, dressed for ceremony rather than battle, found themselves helpless against Spanish steel. Their bronze weapons and quilted armor provided no protection against swords forged from metal they had never encountered. Their wooden shields splintered like kindling against Spanish warhammers. Most devastating of all was the capture of Atahualpa himself. Spanish soldiers fought their way through his bodyguard like reapers cutting grain, their single objective to reach the imperial litter before the emperor could escape. When the golden platform was finally overturned and the son of Inti found himself seized by foreign hands, the psychological shock paralyzed the vast army that surrounded the plaza. Asterisk. For 80,000 Inca warriors, the sight of their divine emperor in the hands of enemies represented something beyond military defeat. It was cosmic catastrophe that challenged everything they understood about the nature of reality. If the son of Inti could be captured by mortals, if the most sacred person in the universe could be treated like a common prisoner, then perhaps the gods themselves had been defeated. The battle that should have annihilated 168 Spanish soldiers ended with perhaps 7,000 Inca dead and not a single Spanish fatality. It was a military impossibility that became historical fact, a victory so complete it seemed to validate Spanish claims about divine favor and indigenous inferiority. Asterisk. In the hours that followed the massacre, as Spanish soldiers collected gold ornaments from the bodies of dead nobles and Inca survivors tried to comprehend what had happened, Atahualpa found himself in a position no Inca emperor had ever faced. He was a prisoner of foreign enemies who held his life in their hands. But the emperor who had conquered an empire through civil war was not prepared to surrender without a fight. If these Spanish desired gold above all else, then he would offer them more gold than they had ever imagined. In exchange for his freedom, Atahualpa promised to fill the room where he was imprisoned with gold plates, once to the height of his raised hand, and to fill it twice more with silver. Asterisk. The ransom that Atahualpa offered represented the greatest treasure ever assembled in human history. From across the empire came golden ornaments stripped from temples, silver vessels taken from noble households, precious metals gathered from the most remote provinces of Tontinsio. The Spanish melted down artifacts that represented centuries of artistic achievement, reducing masterpieces of Inca craftsmanship to ingots of raw metal. For months, the treasure accumulated until the rooms of Cajamarca overflowed with wealth beyond European imagination. The final total, 24 tons of gold and silver, would be worth over $100 million in modern currency. It was enough to fund armies, build palaces, change the balance of power in European politics. Asterisk. But Pizarro faced a dilemma that no amount of gold could solve. As long as Atahualpa lived, he remained a rallying point for Inca resistance. Spanish rule over Peru depended on indigenous acceptance of their conquest, and that acceptance was impossible as long as the legitimate emperor survived in captivity. The very success of the ransom collection demonstrated that Atahualpa still commanded the loyalty of millions of subjects. The trial that condemned Atahualpa to death was a mockery of justice that revealed the true nature of Spanish conquest. Charged with crimes including polygamy, idolatry, and treason against a Spanish king he had never acknowledged, the emperor was condemned by judges who had already decided his fate. His execution on August 29, 1533, marked the end of indigenous independence in Peru and the beginning of 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule. Asterisk. The trap at Cajamarca had succeeded beyond Pizarro's wildest dreams. In a single afternoon, 168 Spanish soldiers had accomplished what should have required decades of warfare. They had not just defeated an army, they had shattered a civilization's faith in itself. The psychological impact of that November day would echo through the generations, creating a trauma so profound that indigenous Andean peoples are still recovering from it today. The gold that flowed from the imperial treasuries would transform European economics, funding the Spanish Empire's expansion and contributing to centuries of inflation that would reshape global trade. But the human cost, the destruction of a sophisticated civilization, the death of millions from disease and exploitation, the cultural genocide that followed the conquest, would prove far more lasting than any monetary treasure. Asterisk. 10. Spanish advantages in indigenous alliances. The conquest of the Inca Empire was not just a triumph of audacity over odds. It was the collision of two worlds separated by thousands of years of technological development, biological evolution, and military innovation. When 168 Spanish conquistadors faced 10 million Inca subjects, they brought with them advantages so profound that they fundamentally altered the balance of power in ways that numbers alone could never overcome. But technology was only part of the story. The real secret of Spanish success lay in their ability to turn the empire's greatest strength, its diversity, into its fatal weakness. The most visible Spanish advantage came thundering across the battlefields on four legs. To European eyes, horses were simply animals, expensive and valuable, certainly, but no more supernatural than oxen or cattle. To indigenous Americans who had never seen anything larger than a llama, horses were living myths that challenged every assumption about the natural world. When Spanish cavalry charged across the plaza at Cajamarca, they weren't just attacking with superior mobility. They were wielding psychological weapons that turned seasoned warriors into terrified children. Inca soldiers who would have fought to the death against human enemies fled in panic before creatures that seemed to combine the speed of condors with the fury of jaguars. The horses themselves were magnificent specimens, carefully selected from Spanish breeding programs that had been perfecting cavalry mounts for centuries of European warfare. Standing 15 hands high and weighing over 1,000 pounds, these animals could carry an armored man at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour across terrain where indigenous warriors struggled to run at half that pace. But the psychological impact went far beyond mere intimidation. In Andean cosmology, animals were spiritual beings with their own sacred powers. The sudden appearance of unknown creatures that obeyed Spanish commands suggested that the foreigners possessed supernatural abilities that allowed them to control forces beyond ordinary human understanding. The Spanish quickly learned to exploit this advantage. They trained their horses to rear and strike with their hooves, turning every cavalry charge into a display of apparently supernatural aggression. They decorated their mounts with bells and ribbons that enhanced the otherworldly spectacle. Most crucially, they made sure that indigenous peoples saw horses and riders as single entities rather than man and animal working together. When the first horses died in battle, Spanish commanders faced a crisis that threatened to destroy their psychological advantage. If indigenous warriors discovered that these supernatural creatures were mortal, the spell would be broken. Spanish soldiers were ordered to bury horse carcasses in secret, to spread stories that the creatures had simply vanished back to the spirit world, to maintain the illusion of invulnerability at all costs. Even more deadly than horses were the weapons that Spanish soldiers carried. Steel was a metal unknown in the Americas, where the most advanced metallurgy produced bronze implements that were serviceable but fragile. When Spanish swords met Inca weapons, the encounter was less a clash of arms than a demonstration of materials science spanning millennia of technological development. A Spanish sword forged from tempered steel could cut through bronze spearheads like scissors through paper. Inca armor made from quilted cotton provided excellent protection against indigenous weapons, but offered no defense against steel blades driven by European muscle and technique. Spanish warhammers could shatter wooden shields with single blows. Spanish daggers could penetrate any armor that indigenous craftsmen had ever devised. But perhaps the most devastating Spanish weapons were those that killed from a distance. Firearms were crude by modern standards, slow to load, difficult to aim, prone to misfiring in damp conditions. But to warriors who had never heard gunpowder explode, these weapons possessed a terror value far beyond their actual lethality. The sound alone was enough to panic entire formations. Thunder was the voice of Alapa, the storm god. one of the most powerful deities in the Andean pantheon. When Spanish arquebuses roared across battlefields, indigenous warriors heard not just weapons, but divine wrath speaking in support of the foreign invaders. The Spanish understood the psychological value of firearms and used them strategically rather than tactically. They would often fire a coordinated volley at the beginning of a battle, not to inflict maximum casualties, but to create maximum terror. The clouds of smoke, the deafening noise, the mysterious ability to kill at impossible distances, all of this suggested that the Spanish commanded supernatural forces that no earthly power could resist. But the most deadly Spanish advantage was invisible, microscopic, and completely unintentional. The diseases that European colonists carried in their blood, smallpox, typhus, measles, influenza, were biological weapons more effective than any technology. Indigenous Americans had been isolated from Old World disease pools for over 10,000 years, leaving them with no immunity to pathogens that were merely childhood ailments in Europe. The demographic catastrophe that followed Spanish contact was unprecedented in human history. Conservative estimates suggest that 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died from disease within a century of European arrival. In some regions, the mortality rate approached 95%, leaving landscapes that had supported millions of people virtually empty within a single generation. This wasn't random misfortune. It was biological warfare on a continental scale, even though the Spanish didn't initially understand the mechanism. Everywhere Spanish expeditions traveled, epidemic disease preceded and followed them, creating corridors of death that facilitated conquest and colonization. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical toll. Indigenous peoples had sophisticated medical knowledge that could treat many ailments, but they had no defense against diseases that their healers had never encountered. When traditional remedies failed, when religious ceremonies provided no protection, when entire communities disappeared despite following all the proper rituals, the foundations of indigenous worldviews began to crumble. Spanish missionaries understood this vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. They preached that the epidemics were divine punishment for idolatry and sin, that only conversion to Christianity could provide protection from God's wrath. When Christian converts seemed to survive at slightly higher rates, usually because they received better medical care from Spanish physicians, it appeared to validate missionary claims about the superiority of the Christian God. But perhaps the Spanish's greatest advantage was their ability to exploit the political fractures within the Inca Empire. The vast territories that Tawantinsuyu controlled had been conquered within living memory, and many ethnic groups retained bitter memories of Inca expansion. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa had reopened old wounds and created new grievances that Spanish diplomats were quick to exploit. The Spanish didn't conquer the Inca Empire. They convinced the Inca Empire to conquer itself. The indigenous allies who joined Spanish expeditions often outnumbered Spanish soldiers by ratios of 10 to 1 or more. These weren't reluctant auxiliaries pressed into service, but enthusiastic partners who saw Spanish victory as their opportunity for revenge against Inca oppression. The Canary people of Ecuador had been brutally suppressed by Atahualpa during the Civil War, their leaders executed, their territories devastated. When Spanish forces arrived in their homeland, they were greeted not as foreign invaders, but as liberators who offered a chance to settle scores with their Inca overlords. Thousands of Canary warriors joined Spanish expeditions, providing not just military strength, but invaluable knowledge of Inca tactics, fortifications, and supply routes. The Huanca people of central Peru had been traditional enemies of the Inca for generations before their conquest. They retained clear memories of independence and harbored deep resentments about forced integration into the imperial system. When Spanish conquistadors reached Huanca territory, they found allies eager to provide intelligence, supplies, and thousands of auxiliary troops. The Chachapoya people of the northern Amazon had been conquered so recently that their resentment of Inca rule was still fresh. Their knowledge of jungle warfare and their hatred of imperial taxation made them natural allies for Spanish forces operating in the eastern territories of the empire. Even groups that had benefited from Inca rule sometimes chose to ally with the Spanish rather than risk being on the losing side of what increasingly appeared to be a divinely ordained conquest. The capture of Atahualpa had shattered the myth of Inca invincibility, and practical leaders concluded that adaptation was preferable to destruction. The Spanish were skilled at exploiting these divisions through a combination of diplomacy, bribery, and intimidation. They promised local leaders that Spanish rule would be lighter than Inca administration, that traditional customs would be respected, that collaboration would be rewarded with positions of authority in the new colonial government. These promises were rarely kept, but they were effective in the short term. By the time indigenous allies realized that Spanish colonialism was far more oppressive than Inca imperialism had ever been, the conquest was complete and resistance had become impossible. The Spanish also understood the importance of legitimacy in indigenous political systems. Rather than ruling directly through Spanish administrators, they maintained the fiction that they were governing through legitimate Inca authority. They installed puppet emperors from the royal family, preserved some imperial ceremonies, and allowed Inca nobles to retain ceremonial positions that gave Spanish rule an appearance of continuity with traditional government. This strategy of indirect rule was remarkably effective in the early years of colonial administration. Indigenous peoples who might have resisted obvious foreign domination found it much harder to rebel against what appeared to be legitimate Inca government, even when that government was clearly controlled by Spanish interests. The Spanish also exploited indigenous communication systems to spread their version of events throughout the empire. The same Chasca runners who had once carried imperial commands now carried Spanish proclamations. The same Quipu records that had once tracked tribute obligations now recorded Spanish demands for labor and resources. But perhaps the most effective Spanish strategy was their systematic destruction of indigenous leadership structures. They didn't just kill Inca emperors. They eliminated the entire intellectual and administrative class that had made imperial government possible. Priests, record keepers, engineers, teachers, military commanders, anyone with the knowledge and authority to organize resistance was targeted for elimination. This cultural genocide was far more devastating than military conquest. Armies could be rebuilt, territories could be reconquered, but the loss of institutional knowledge and leadership capabilities created a vacuum that took generations to fill. By the time indigenous communities had developed new forms of organization and resistance, Spanish colonial rule had become entrenched beyond any possibility of overthrow. The combination of technological superiority, biological warfare, political manipulation, and cultural genocide created a perfect storm that made Spanish conquest not just possible, but inevitable once it began. The Inca Empire didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it encountered forces that no indigenous American society could have resisted. Yet even with all these advantages, Spanish victory was never guaranteed. Indigenous resistance would continue for decades, requiring constant vigilance and periodic military campaigns to suppress. The conquest of the Inca Empire was complete in legal terms by 1533, but it would take 40 more years of warfare to establish effective Spanish control over the entire territory. 11. The Great Rebellion. The conquest of the Inca Empire was not the swift, decisive victory that Spanish chroniclers would later claim. In the shadows of apparent Spanish triumph, a resistance was forming that would challenge European rule for 4 decades and create the last independent indigenous kingdom in the Americas. The man who would lead this rebellion was not a stranger to Spanish ways. He was their chosen puppet emperor, a royal prince who had learned to hate his masters from the inside of their own councils of power. Manco Inca Yupanqui had seemed like the perfect solution to Spanish administrative problems in the aftermath of Atahualpa's execution. A legitimate member of the royal family, young enough to be molded, intelligent enough to be useful, he appeared to offer everything the conquistadors needed: a compliant native ruler who could legitimize Spanish rule while providing administrative continuity with the imperial past. When Francisco Pizarro placed the royal fringe upon Manco's head in a ceremony that combined Inca ritual with Spanish political theater, both sides believed they had achieved their objectives. The Spanish gained an emperor who would rule in their name, sign their documents, and lend indigenous legitimacy to foreign conquest. Manco gained recognition as Sapa Inca, and the hope that cooperation might preserve something of his people's independence within the framework of Spanish colonial rule. For 2 years, this arrangement seemed to work. Manco issued proclamations in the imperial style, maintained the ceremonial aspects of Inca government, and helped Spanish administrators understand the complex tribute and labor systems that sustained the empire. Spanish chroniclers described him as an ideal native ruler, intelligent, cooperative, and properly grateful for the benefits of Christian civilization. But beneath this facade of collaboration, Manco was learning lessons that would prove deadly to Spanish interests. He was studying Spanish military techniques, observing their strengths and weaknesses, mapping their supply lines and communication networks. Most importantly, he was discovering that Spanish promises of respect for indigenous customs and limited interference in native affairs were lies designed to pacify resistance until conquest could be consolidated. The breaking point came gradually, through a series of humiliations that revealed the true nature of Spanish attitudes toward even their most valued indigenous allies. Spanish soldiers treated the Sapa Inca, a figure considered divine by millions of people, as a convenient figurehead to be ignored when useful and bullied when inconvenient. They demanded access to his palace, his treasures, his wives. They mocked his religious ceremonies and desecrated the temples that had been sacred for centuries. The final insult came when Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's brother, accused Manco of plotting rebellion and had him imprisoned in chains like a common criminal. For weeks, the emperor who claimed descent from the sun god was held in a Spanish jail, his food rationed, his movements restricted, his dignity systematically destroyed by men who had once professed their respect for his royal authority. But Spanish treatment of Manco was merely a symptom of broader policies that were devastating indigenous communities throughout the former empire. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from entire native populations. The requirements for conversion to Christianity were enforced through violence and intimidation. Traditional leaders were replaced by Spanish appointees who had no understanding of local customs or needs. Most devastating of all was the treatment of indigenous women. Spanish soldiers considered native women to be spoils of war, available for their pleasure without regard for existing marriages, family relationships, or social positions. The systematic sexual exploitation that followed Spanish conquest created a trauma that cut to the heart of indigenous social structures. When Manco finally escaped from Spanish custody in April 1536, he carried with him not just personal grievances, but the accumulated rage of millions of people who had discovered that Spanish rule meant not civilization, but degradation, not salvation, but exploitation, not partnership, but slavery disguised by legal documents and religious rhetoric. The rebellion that Manco organized over the following months was unlike anything in the history of Spanish colonization. This was not a spontaneous uprising or a regional revolt, but a coordinated continental war effort that mobilized resources on a scale that matched the original Inca conquests. From every corner of the former empire came warriors, weapons, supplies, and intelligence as indigenous communities prepared for a final struggle to expel the foreign invaders. The army that assembled around Manco represented the largest indigenous military force ever organized in the Americas after European contact. Conservative estimates place its size at 100,000 warriors, but some Spanish sources claim it reached 200,000, a force that dwarfed any army the conquistadors could field and rivaled the great military formations of European warfare. But this was not simply a return to traditional Inca military tactics. Manco had learned from Spanish methods and adapted them to indigenous capabilities. His forces included cavalry units mounted on horses captured from Spanish settlements. His arsenals contained firearms taken from dead conquistadors and repaired by indigenous craftsmen. His intelligence networks used captured Spanish documents to understand colonial administrative structures and exploit their weaknesses. The strategy that Manco implemented was revolutionary in its sophistication. Rather than attempting to meet Spanish forces in open battle where European technological advantages would be decisive, he planned a coordinated series of attacks designed to isolate Spanish strongholds and cut their supply lines. Every major Spanish settlement would be attacked simultaneously, preventing the conquistadors from concentrating their forces or supporting each other. The rebellion began on May 6, 1536, with attacks that stretched across the entire western coast of South America. Lima, the new Spanish capital, found itself under siege by forces that had materialized seemingly from nowhere. Spanish settlements in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile reported coordinated assaults that suggested a level of organization that European commanders had thought impossible for indigenous forces. But the crucial battle was fought in Cusco itself, where 190 Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies found themselves surrounded by Manco's main army in the sacred city that had been the heart of the Inca Empire. The siege that followed would last nearly a year and come closer to destroying Spanish power in Peru than any other challenge the conquistadors would face. The assault on Cusco began with an attack on Sacsayhuaman, the massive fortress that overlooked the city from the north. If Manco's forces could capture this strong point, they would command the entire valley and be able to rain destruction down on Spanish positions with impunity. The battle for Sacsayhuaman became the focal point of the entire rebellion, a struggle that would determine whether Spanish conquest could be reversed or indigenous independence was lost forever. The Spanish garrison that defended Sacsayhuaman consisted of perhaps 50 soldiers commanded by Juan Pizarro, Francisco's youngest brother. They faced an assault by thousands of indigenous warriors who attacked with a fury born of generations of accumulated grievances. The fighting was savage beyond anything that veterans of European wars had experienced. Hand-to-hand combat with bronze weapons against steel, desperation against determination, the fury of the dispossessed against the arrogance of conquerors. For 3 days, the battle raged across the terraces and walls of the ancient fortress. Spanish firearms carved bloody lanes through attacking formations, but indigenous warriors filled the gaps and pressed forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Spanish cavalry charges broke indigenous formations, but new attackers emerged from every direction to replace those who had fallen. The turning point came when Juan Pizarro was killed by a stone hurled from the fortress walls, the first member of the Pizarro family to die in the conquest of Peru. His death galvanized Spanish resistance, while demonstrating to indigenous forces that their enemies were indeed mortal. When Sacsayhuaman finally fell to Manco's warriors, the impossible had become reality. Indigenous forces had defeated Spanish soldiers in direct combat and captured the most important fortress in Peru, With Sacsayhuaman in indigenous hands, the siege of Cusco proper could begin in earnest. Manco's engineers, many of whom had learned Spanish techniques during the years of apparent cooperation, turned captured Spanish weapons against their former masters. Cannons taken from defeated garrisons were used to bombard Spanish positions. Firearms captured from dead soldiers were turned against their surviving comrades. But the most effective weapons in the indigenous arsenal were fire arrows that could set Spanish buildings ablaze and psychological warfare that exploited Spanish fears about being overwhelmed by vast numbers of enemies fighting on their home territory. Spanish soldiers who had seemed invincible when attacking surprised indigenous communities found themselves trapped in a hostile city where every street corner might hide death and every building might become their tomb. The siege reached its climax during the winter months of 1536, when Spanish supplies ran desperately low and indigenous attacks intensified. Spanish soldiers were reduced to eating their horses, the very animals that had given them such decisive advantages in earlier battles. They melted down gold artifacts to make bullets for their firearms. They tore up floor planks to build barricades against indigenous assaults. Several relief expeditions sent from Lima were annihilated en route to Cusco, their soldiers killed, and their supplies captured by indigenous forces who had learned to use Spanish tactics against Spanish armies. For months, it appeared that the entire Spanish colonial project in Peru would collapse and that Manco's rebellion would achieve what no indigenous leader since the conquest had thought possible: the complete expulsion of European invaders. What saved Spanish Cusco was not military superiority, but logistical reality. Manco's army, for all its size and determination, was fundamentally an agricultural society mobilized for war. When planting season arrived in October 1536, tens of thousands of warriors had to return to their communities to ensure that crops would be available for the following year. The indigenous forces that had maintained the siege through sheer numbers suddenly found themselves reduced to a fraction of their original strength. The Spanish breakthrough came in April 1537, when Diego de Almagro returned from his failed expedition to Chile with 400 fresh soldiers and immediately marched to relieve Cusco. His arrival provided just enough additional strength to break the siege and force Manco's remaining forces to retreat from the sacred city they had held for nearly a year. But Manco's retreat was not a defeat. It was a strategic withdrawal that marked the beginning of a new phase in indigenous resistance. Rather than attempting to hold fixed positions where Spanish technological advantages would eventually prove decisive, he established a mobile government in the remote region of Vilcabamba, 60 miles northwest of Cusco in some of the most inaccessible terrain in the Andes. The Neo-Inca state that Manco created in Vilcabamba was remarkable for its combination of traditional Inca governmental structures with innovations forced by the realities of resistance warfare. He maintained the full ceremonial apparatus of imperial rule: the golden litter, the royal regalia, the elaborate court rituals that demonstrated continuity with the glorious past. But he also created new military formations designed for guerrilla warfare, new administrative systems that could function without the elaborate infrastructure of the original empire, and new diplomatic protocols for dealing with Spanish colonial authorities as equals rather than superiors. From his mountain stronghold, Manco conducted a guerrilla war that would continue for the next 8 years, striking at Spanish interests throughout Peru and maintaining indigenous hope that the conquest could still be reversed. His forces ambushed Spanish supply convoys, attacked isolated settlements, recruited new fighters from indigenous communities that had been terrorized by colonial exploitation, and demonstrated that Spanish rule could never be entirely secure as long as a legitimate Inca emperor remained free to challenge their authority. The war that Manco waged was as much psychological as military. Every successful ambush, every Spanish settlement abandoned due to indigenous pressure, every colonial official forced to flee for his life demonstrated that Spanish power was not invincible and that indigenous resistance remained possible despite overwhelming odds. When Spanish assassins finally killed Manco Inca in 1544, they eliminated a leader but not a movement. His son Seri Tupac continued the resistance, followed by Titu Cusi Yupanqui, and finally by Tupac Amaru I. For 36 years, the Neo-Inca state maintained indigenous independence in the heart of the former empire, proving that Spanish conquest was neither complete nor irreversible. The Great Rebellion that began with Manco's escape from Cusco in 1536 was ultimately unsuccessful in expelling Spanish colonial rule, but it achieved something equally important. It demonstrated that indigenous peoples were not passive victims of European expansion, but active agents of their own history, capable of learning from their enemies, adapting to new circumstances, and maintaining resistance even under the most impossible conditions. 12. The final conquest. By 1572, the Neo-Inca state had survived for 36 years in the cloud forests of Vilcabamba, longer than many European kingdoms, longer than the entire Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, longer than anyone had thought possible when Manco Inca first retreated to these remote mountains. But survival and victory are different things, and the indigenous kingdom that Tupac Amaru I inherited from his predecessors was a shadow of the empire that had once ruled the Andes. The young man who wore the royal fringe of the Inca in the hidden city of Vilcabamba was the last of his line, literally the end of a dynasty that claimed descent from the sun god himself. At 25, Tupac Amaru had known no life except resistance, no world except the precarious existence of a government in exile, no reality except the gradual erosion of indigenous independence under the relentless pressure of Spanish colonial expansion. The kingdom he ruled bore little resemblance to the mighty Tawantinsuyu that his ancestors had governed. Where once the Inca had commanded millions of subjects across thousands of miles, Tupac Amaru's authority extended over perhaps 10,000 people scattered through mountain valleys so remote that Spanish maps didn't even acknowledge their existence. Where once the imperial treasury had overflowed with gold and silver from across the known world, the Neo-Inca state survived on whatever precious metals could be extracted from small mines worked by free indigenous labor. Yet even in its diminished state, Vilcabamba remained a powerful symbol that challenged the very foundations of Spanish colonial rule. As long as a legitimate Inca emperor maintained his independence, as long as indigenous peoples could point to a free kingdom that preserved traditional ways of life, as long as the royal bloodline continued unbroken in the mountains of Peru, Spanish claims to have conquered the Inca Empire remained incomplete. More dangerously, the Neo-Inca state had evolved from a military threat into something far more subversive, a proof of concept that indigenous self-government remained possible. The kingdom's very survival demonstrated that Spanish technology and military superiority were not insurmountable advantages, that indigenous peoples could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their essential identity, that the conquest was neither divinely ordained nor historically inevitable. The Spanish authorities who governed Peru from their comfortable palaces in Lima understood this challenge perfectly. Every successful harvest in Vilcabamba's terraces was a rebuke to Spanish claims about indigenous inferiority. Every diplomatic message from Tupac Amaru that addressed Spanish officials as equals rather than superiors undermined colonial hierarchies. Every indigenous person who spoke of the free Inca in the mountains threatened the psychological foundations of a system built on indigenous acceptance of European superiority. Previous Spanish administrators had been content to contain the Neo-Inca state rather than destroy it. The remote location made military campaigns expensive and dangerous. The kingdom's small size limited its capacity for large-scale military operations. Most importantly, the gradual integration of indigenous peoples into Spanish colonial society seemed to be reducing support for the exiled government naturally, without the need for costly military interventions. But in 1569, everything changed with the arrival of Francisco de Toledo as the new viceroy of Peru. Unlike his predecessors, Toledo was not a conquistador seeking quick wealth or a colonial administrator focused on maintaining stability. He was a professional bureaucrat with a mandate from King Philip II to rationalize Spanish rule in Peru, eliminate sources of instability, and transform the colony into an efficient source of revenue for the Spanish crown. Toledo's analysis of the situation was coldly logical. The survival of an independent Inca kingdom, no matter how small or remote, represented an unacceptable challenge to Spanish sovereignty. Every year that Tupac Amaru remained free was another year that indigenous peoples could hope for the restoration of their independence. Every diplomatic communication from Vilcabamba implied that Spanish rule was temporary and illegitimate. Every indigenous person who made pilgrimage to the hidden kingdom carried back dangerous ideas about resistance and self-determination. The new viceroy's solution was characteristically methodical: the complete elimination of indigenous independence in Peru. Not containment, not negotiation, not the gradual integration that previous administrators had pursued, but the total destruction of Vilcabamba and the execution of every member of the royal family who might serve as a future rallying point for indigenous resistance. Toledo spent 3 years preparing for what he knew would be the final campaign of the conquest of Peru. He assembled detailed intelligence about Vilcabamba's defenses, supply lines, and escape routes. He recruited indigenous allies who could serve as guides through terrain that Spanish soldiers had never successfully penetrated. He positioned troops and supplies to prevent any possibility that Tupac Amaru could escape to establish another exile kingdom in an even more remote location. The pretext for the final assault came in 1571, when indigenous warriors from Vilcabamba killed several Spanish envoys who had been sent to negotiate with Tupac Amaru. Whether these killings were ordered by the Inca emperor or were unauthorized actions by overzealous followers would never be definitively established. But Toledo had the justification he needed to launch a campaign of total war against the last independent indigenous kingdom in the Americas. The army that Toledo assembled for the Vilcabamba campaign was unlike any force that had been used in previous operations against the Neo-Inca state. More than 1,000 Spanish soldiers, supported by thousands of indigenous auxiliaries, equipped with the latest firearms and artillery, supplied through logistics networks that could sustain operations in the most remote terrain for months at a time. This was not a raid or a punitive expedition. It was a war of extermination designed to end indigenous independence forever. The campaign began in June 1572, with multiple columns advancing into Vilcabamba territory from different directions to prevent any possibility of escape. Spanish forces moved methodically through the cloud forests, destroying every settlement they encountered, capturing or killing every indigenous person they found, eliminating any infrastructure that could support continued resistance. Visual: the systematic advance of Spanish forces through the cloud forests, showing the methodical destruction. Narrator: but when the Spanish finally reached the city of Vilcabamba itself in September 1572, they found it completely abandoned. Warned of the approaching army, Tupac Amaru had ordered the evacuation of his capital and the destruction of anything that might be useful to the invaders. The Spanish entered a ghost city where the only inhabitants were the stones themselves, massive blocks fitted together with the precision that had made Inca architecture famous, but now serving as monuments to a civilization that had chosen to destroy itself rather than submit to foreign rule. The systematic destruction of Vilcabamba was one of the most thorough acts of cultural vandalism in the history of Spanish colonization. Spanish soldiers looted whatever gold and silver they could find, then set fire to buildings that had housed the last free indigenous government in the Americas. Libraries of Quipu records that preserved the final chapters of Inca history were burned as pagan superstition. Temples that had maintained traditional religious practices were stripped of their sacred objects and demolished. But Tupac Amaru himself had escaped into the Amazon lowlands with a small group of followers, hoping to establish a new base of operations in terrain so remote and hostile that Spanish forces would never be able to follow. For several weeks, it seemed that the last Inca had successfully evaded capture and that the campaign to eliminate indigenous independence had failed at the crucial moment. The pursuit that followed was one of the most difficult military operations in Spanish colonial history. Spanish soldiers accustomed to highland warfare found themselves struggling through tropical rainforests where every step was contested by hostile terrain, dangerous wildlife, and indigenous warriors who knew every tree and stream. Diseases that were minor annoyances in the mountains became deadly threats in the humid lowlands. Supply lines that had worked efficiently in familiar territory broke down completely in the unmapped wilderness of the Amazon basin. But Spanish determination and indigenous treachery finally achieved what military superiority alone could not accomplish. After 6 weeks of pursuit, Spanish forces located Tupac Amaru's camp and captured the last Inca emperor while he slept, bringing to an end 40 years of indigenous independence and 500 years of continuous Inca rule in Peru. The trial that followed was even more of a legal farce than the proceedings that had condemned Atahualpa 4 decades earlier. Tupac Amaru was charged with crimes including murder, treason, and practicing idolatry, accusations that assumed Spanish legal jurisdiction over a territory that had never acknowledged Spanish sovereignty and a ruler who had never accepted Spanish authority. The trial's outcome was never in doubt. but its conduct revealed the extent to which Spanish colonial policy had hardened since the early years of conquest. Where Atahualpa had been offered the opportunity to convert to Christianity and accept Spanish rule, Tupac Amaru was given no such option. Toledo had decided that the mere existence of a legitimate Inca heir was incompatible with Spanish security, regardless of whether that heir was willing to cooperate with colonial authorities. The defense that Tupac Amaru's advocates mounted was both legally sophisticated and politically hopeless. They argued that Spanish jurisdiction did not extend to actions taken by the ruler of an independent kingdom, that the killing of Spanish envoys had been justified acts of war rather than criminal murders, that the charges of idolatry could not apply to religious practices that predated Christianity in the Americas by thousands of years. But Toledo's tribunal was less interested in legal precedent than in political necessity. Every day that Tupac Amaru remained alive was another day that indigenous peoples could hope for the restoration of their independence. Every legal argument that acknowledged his legitimacy as a ruler was another challenge to Spanish claims of conquest. The verdict was predetermined by political calculation rather than judicial process. On September 24, 1572, in the main plaza of Cusco where his ancestors have been worshipped as living gods, Tupac Amaru was publicly executed before a crowd that included thousands of indigenous spectators who had traveled from across Peru to witness the end of their world. The scene was a masterpiece of colonial theater designed to demonstrate the finality of Spanish victory and the futility of further resistance. But even in death, Tupac Amaru proved to be a more dangerous enemy than Spanish authorities had anticipated. Instead of accepting his execution as divine judgment on indigenous resistance, many spectators interpreted it as martyrdom that proved Spanish rule was based on violence rather than legitimacy. Indigenous chroniclers would later write that the earth itself trembled when the last Inca died, that the sun darkened in grief, that the very stones of Cusco wept for their murdered lord. The execution of Tupac Amaru marked the end of indigenous political independence in Peru, but it also marked the beginning of indigenous cultural resistance that would prove far more durable than any military campaign. The last Inca became a symbol of indigenous dignity that Spanish colonial rule could never completely suppress, a reminder that indigenous peoples had once ruled themselves and might someday do so again. Francisco de Toledo had achieved his objective of eliminating the last source of organized indigenous resistance in Peru, but at a cost that would haunt Spanish colonial rule for the remaining 2.5 centuries of its existence. By destroying the possibility of indigenous political compromise, he had guaranteed that future resistance would be revolutionary rather than reformist, violent rather than negotiated, total rather than limited. The final conquest of the Inca Empire was complete, but the conquest of the Inca people had only just begun. In the mountains and valleys where Tupac Amaru's ancestors had once ruled an empire, indigenous communities would preserve the memory of independence, maintain traditional customs in secret, and wait for the opportunity to reclaim what had been taken from them. The Spanish had won the war, but they had not won the peace. That struggle would continue for centuries to come. 13. Colonial aftermath and cultural survival. In the aftermath of conquest, a new world was born from the ashes of the old. Not the shining Christian civilization that Spanish missionaries had promised, but something far more complex and tragic. The colonial society that emerged in the former Inca Empire was built literally on the bones of indigenous peoples, sustained by the labor of the survivors, and haunted by the ghosts of a destroyed civilization that refused to stay buried. The numbers alone tell a story of catastrophe that defies comprehension. When Spanish conquistadors first arrived in Peru in 1532, they encountered an empire of perhaps 10 to 15 million people, a population density that rivaled contemporary Europe and supported cities larger than any in Spain. By 1600, fewer than 1 million indigenous people remained alive in the same territory. 9 out of every 10 people had vanished in less than a century. Victims of disease, warfare, forced labor, and the systematic destruction of the social structures that had sustained life in the Andes for millennia. This demographic catastrophe was unprecedented in human history. The Black Death that devastated medieval Europe killed perhaps one-third of the population over several decades. The Great Famines of China eliminated millions over the course of years. But nothing in recorded history approached the speed and completeness of indigenous population collapse in the Americas, a Holocaust that unfolded not over generations, but within the lifetime of individuals who remembered the world before Spanish contact. The diseases that Spanish colonists carried in their blood, smallpox, typhus, measles, influenza, plague, swept through indigenous communities like wildfire through dry grass. Entire villages were depopulated so quickly that there was no one left to bury the dead. Traditional medical knowledge that had sustained Andean peoples for thousands of years proved useless against pathogens that their bodies had never encountered. Healers who had been revered for their ability to cure illness died alongside their patients, leaving survivors with no explanation for the catastrophe except divine punishment or cosmic collapse. But disease was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The Spanish colonial system that replaced Inca administration was designed not to govern indigenous peoples, but to extract maximum wealth from them with minimum investment in their welfare. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from entire native communities in exchange for the theoretical obligation to provide military protection and Christian instruction. In practice, the encomienda became a license for exploitation that would have shocked even the harshest Inca administrators. Where the MITA system had required limited seasonal labor in exchange for guaranteed food security and community welfare, Spanish colonial demands were unlimited and uncompensated. Indigenous workers were forced to labor in conditions so dangerous that survival for more than a few years was unlikely. The silver mines of Potosi became a death sentence for the thousands of indigenous men conscripted to work in tunnels that collapsed regularly and filled with poisonous gases. The Spanish colonial administration that governed Peru was a bureaucratic nightmare that combined the worst aspects of medieval feudalism with the ruthless efficiency of early capitalism. At the top of this system sat the viceroy, representing the Spanish crown with absolute authority over territories larger than all of Europe. Below him, a hierarchy of Spanish officials administered provinces, districts, and municipalities with powers that would have made Roman emperors envious. But the real power in colonial Peru lay with the encomenderos, Spanish colonists who had been granted rights to indigenous labor and tribute. These men lived like feudal lords on estates, worked by indigenous servants who had no legal rights and no recourse against abuse. The wealth they extracted flowed not into productive investment that might have benefited local communities, but across the Atlantic to Spain, where it funded European wars and royal extravagance. The legal framework that governed colonial society was designed to maintain Spanish supremacy through a rigid caste system that defined every person's rights and obligations based on their racial ancestry. At the top were the peninsulars, Spanish-born colonists who monopolized the highest government positions and most lucrative commercial opportunities. Below them came the criollos, American-born descendants of Spanish parents who dominated local commerce and lesser administrative posts. The vast majority of the population consisted of indigenous peoples, who were classified as perpetual minors requiring Spanish supervision for their own welfare. They could not own property in their own names, could not travel without permission, could not engage in commerce except under Spanish oversight, could not practice their traditional religions, could not educate their children in their ancestral languages. Yet even within this oppressive system, indigenous peoples found ways to resist, adapt, and preserve essential aspects of their cultural identity. The process of cultural survival that began in the immediate aftermath of conquest would prove to be one of the most remarkable examples of human resilience in history. The Spanish had destroyed the Inca Empire, executed its leaders, and imposed an alien social system, but they had not destroyed the indigenous peoples who were the empire's true foundation. In thousands of small communities scattered across the Andes, traditional ways of life persisted beneath the surface of colonial administration. The Ayllu kinship system continued to organize family relationships and community obligations. Traditional agricultural techniques maintained productivity on lands that Spanish methods would have exhausted. Indigenous languages preserved knowledge that Spanish education systematically tried to eliminate. The strategy that indigenous communities developed for cultural survival was complex and sophisticated, a form of resistance that appeared to be accommodation, a way of preserving the essential while sacrificing the superficial. Indigenous peoples learned to speak Spanish in public while maintaining their ancestral languages at home. They attended Catholic masses while secretly honoring their traditional deities. They worked in Spanish colonial enterprises while organizing their own economic networks according to ancient principles of reciprocity. The most visible example of this cultural synthesis was the religious syncretism that emerged in colonial churches throughout Peru. Spanish missionaries had built their churches on the exact foundations of Inca temples, believing that they were replacing paganism with Christianity. What they actually created were hybrid sacred spaces where indigenous peoples could honor their ancestral deities under the guise of Catholic worship. The Virgin of Copacabana, the patron saint of Bolivia, was worshipped in exactly the same location where indigenous peoples had honored Mama Quilla, the moon goddess, for centuries before Spanish contact. The festival of Corpus Christi in Cusco coincided precisely with traditional Inca celebrations of the winter solstice. Saints' days throughout the year provided opportunities for indigenous communities to maintain traditional ceremonies that Spanish authorities interpreted as evidence of successful Christian conversion. This religious syncretism was not simply a matter of replacing one set of symbols with another. It was a sophisticated theological adaptation that allowed indigenous peoples to maintain their essential spiritual relationships while avoiding persecution for idolatry. Indigenous artists working on colonial churches encoded traditional religious symbols into apparently Christian iconography. Weavers incorporated ancient patterns into textiles that appeared to depict Catholic saints. Musicians composed hymns that used European musical forms to preserve indigenous melodies and rhythms. The educational system that Spanish missionaries established to indoctrinate indigenous children had the unintended effect of creating a class of bicultural intellectuals who could navigate both Spanish and indigenous worlds with equal facility. These young people learned to read and write Spanish while maintaining their ability to interpret Quipu records. They studied Catholic theology while preserving their knowledge of traditional religious practices. They mastered European legal concepts while understanding indigenous customary law. Some of these indigenous intellectuals used their bicultural knowledge to become advocates for their communities within the Spanish colonial system. They wrote petitions to Spanish courts documenting abuses of indigenous rights. They served as interpreters and intermediaries who could explain Spanish legal requirements to indigenous communities while helping Spanish administrators understand traditional indigenous customs. But perhaps the most important form of cultural survival was the preservation of historical memory through oral traditions that maintain knowledge of the pre-Columbian past despite Spanish efforts to erase indigenous history. In communities throughout the former empire, elders continued to tell stories of Inca emperors, to recite genealogies of traditional leaders, to preserve maps of ancient territorial boundaries, to maintain knowledge of traditional technologies and agricultural techniques. These oral traditions served not just as entertainment, but as resistance, a way of maintaining indigenous identity in the face of Spanish claims that indigenous peoples had no history worth preserving. Every story about Inca achievements challenged Spanish assertions of indigenous inferiority. Every preserved genealogy contradicted colonial claims that indigenous peoples had no legitimate political traditions. Every remembered territory boundary disputed Spanish land grants based on the fiction that the Americas had been empty wilderness before European arrival. The textile arts became particularly important vehicles for cultural preservation, because they combined practical necessity with symbolic communication. Spanish authorities required indigenous peoples to produce textiles for colonial markets, but they paid little attention to the patterns and designs that indigenous weavers incorporated into their work. Traditional symbols that had once adorned royal robes and ceremonial textiles found new life in blankets, clothing, and household goods that circulated throughout colonial society. A Spanish colonial official examining an indigenous textile might see only decorative patterns with no particular significance. But indigenous viewers could read these same patterns as historical chronicles that preserved information about family lineages, territorial rights, astronomical observations, and religious ceremonies. The textiles became books written in a visual language that Spanish authorities never learned to decode. Asterisk. The Spanish colonial system that had seemed so completely victorious in 1572 was gradually being subverted from within by the very people it was designed to control. Indigenous communities that appeared to have accepted Spanish rule were actually creating parallel institutions that maintained traditional values while adapting to colonial requirements. Indigenous individuals who seemed to have assimilated into Spanish society were often serving as bridges that allowed their communities to access colonial resources while preserving their essential identity. This cultural resistance was largely invisible to Spanish observers, who interpreted indigenous compliance as evidence of successful colonization. Spanish chroniclers wrote confidently about the triumph of Christian civilization over pagan barbarism, the grateful acceptance of European guidance by inferior indigenous peoples, the inevitable progress toward complete cultural assimilation. Asterisk. What they failed to understand was that indigenous peoples had not been conquered. They had adapted. The cultures that survived the demographic catastrophe of the 16th century were not the same as the cultures that had existed before Spanish contact, but they were recognizably indigenous rather than European. They preserved essential values, maintained crucial knowledge, and sustained identities that would prove far more durable than the Spanish colonial system that claimed to have replaced them. By 1600, a new form of indigenous civilization had emerged in the Andes, one that could function within Spanish colonial structures while maintaining its essential character. This hybrid culture would prove to be remarkably resilient, surviving not just Spanish colonialism, but also the republican governments that replaced Spanish rule, the economic modernization of the 19th and 20th centuries, and the globalization of the contemporary world. Asterisk. The Spanish had succeeded in destroying the Inca Empire, but they had failed in their larger objective of creating a European society in the Americas. What emerged instead was something unprecedented in human history. A colonial civilization that was simultaneously European and indigenous, Christian and pagan, modern and traditional. A synthesis that neither conquerors nor conquered had anticipated, but that both would be forced to live with for centuries to come.